Section 1 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 7, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 1. The Sisters of the Silver Palace, a tale from the Italian Chronicles. I'm going to tell you a tale of two beautiful maidens and their lovers, as true as any other fablio, and as long, bright ladies and noble gentlemen, as your patience will desire. The Chronicles do not declare in what year of our Lord it was that the Count Giambattista Magliano and his daughters inhabited the noble Silver Palace, which, as you know, doubtless, was the name of the most goodly casa on the Brenta. Count Giambattista was a strange man. No one spoke well of him. The most liberal of the fathers of the monastery hard by, who took tithe of his domains in roasted and boiled, yea, and in fish also. The cardinal, who had dined with him the oftenest, made a wry mouth when his name was mentioned. A sorcerer he was thought by some, by others a plotter, but all agreed he was a miser, and pitied his two daughters, the Lady Alda and the Lady Angelica. For a hard life, said the gossips, must they have had, the one to squeeze from the old churl the feathers she used to adorn herself with, the other that rare net for the hair of pearls which had hung up for a 12-month in the market at Damascus and never found a purchaser, it was so costly. Every one, I say, pitied these maidens, and owned the same to be wonderful for their fair looks and their varying blandishments, but with all that, lovers came but scantily to the Silver Palace, and rode away as they came, pretty speedily, whether out of starvation or from disappointment in not having found in the fair ones all that was expected of sweetness and modesty is not known to me. At length it fell out that between age and the east wind, the Count Magliano deceased. He was tended carefully by his children, and the Lady Alda would have it that to the last his habits of spare living should be continued. Also, dutifully, the Lady Angelica refused him the clothes to his couch, which he would, if in his sound senses, have despised, but for which, being now somewhat light-headed, he did pray mightily. None but they two were with the father at the hour of his decease, and I have heard that before the evening of that day, ere his death was known to the household, they had searched every nook and crevice of the Silver Palace, finding neither gold nor jewels, nor token of the same, but many scrolls, in which large sums of money owed by their father were set down. In short, so far from being a miser, the Count Magliano had owned nothing to hoard, save the name of being a pinching man. The saints forgive him. Sister, said the Lady Alda, this is a woeful chance. A woeful chance indeed, replied the Lady Angelica, and hopeless, unless we make our wits help us. Let us hide that our father is deceased, at least till we are married. I fear then, answered the Lady Alda, that we must go to great cost in embalming. Wilt thou give thy pearl net? Not till I have caught it in some better prize than my ancient German Graf Alberic with the grey beard. But while we are talking, the news will be abroad, so the prudent maidens had the old man buried quietly in the dusk of the evening, and they closed up his chamber, and gave out that he lay sick, watched there by one old serving man. There were none to question this, save their poor maid and follower, for the large retinue of the Silver Palace had, one by one, dropped away, some out of discontent to seek better service, some, like the Count of 80 years, scanty food, spare clothing, and the east wind. Graf Alberic with the grey beard, said the Lady Alda to herself, when she walked alone, Heaven keep us all from unequal matches, and devoutly she crossed herself. My once faithful suitor, the Marquis Oviedo, is half a year older than this German bear, and that squint of his, how it puts mine eyes wrong whenever I look at him. Oh, never, never, better starve than marry him. What can the young cavaliers be doing? A year went by, a long and dreary season of probation, as was observed by prudent neighbours, who nevertheless offered no help for maidens nursing their sick parent, and for creditors awaiting his death to be paid by the heiresses. Rarely were the ladies Alda and Angelica seen at Mass, and many a friar repulsed when he would have confessed them or come to the speech of the sick man preached lustily against the hat and feathers and the net of pearls and the satin and the furred ropes and the hanging sleeves which set the eyes of the congregation a-wandering, mostly those of the young men. They were bidden to few revels, for the rumour of what their estate was like to prove had all but reached even persons so ancient and deaf as the Count Alberic with the grey beard, and the squinting Marquis Oviedo. But though, as I said, the eyes of the young men followed their steps, and though they remained to be the envy of all the women for their proud looks and rich garments, the grapes were hanging purple on the trees in the second year of their orphanhood, and still, whenever the maidens spoke together, they joined in the lamentable inquiry, what can the young cavaliers be doing? I say whenever they spoke together, because it is believed that each sister was cheered by hopeful thoughts of comfort when alone. The Lady Alda had been whispered to while at Mass, shame that such traffickings should enter the house of God, by a splendidly attired young gallant, whose velvet doublet and perfumed busking and barret cap clasped with a shining jewel were the least of his attractions, so honey-sweet were his words, so bold but not to unseemliness were his eyes. And the Lady Alda had listened and looked and let drop something of a gentle and complying answer, mingled artfully with fears of her churlish father and of her jealous sister, until these moving discourses had reached the mention of a certain arch in the garden wall of the Silver Palace, and of a certain vesper time at which the Marquis Oviedo was coming to claim her hand, and her cruel father had threatened to rise from his sick bed to sell the maiden to that squinting Spanish nobleman. Ah, Lady Alda confided not to the Prince Armonio Giocoso, such was the name of the swain, that father she had none, and that the Spaniard had been lured on by herself with good words, till he believed himself indeed the choice of her love. Will you wonder then that strenuously and secretly did she hide this blessing of a young handsome wooer, for such she deemed it, from her sister? Meanwhile the Lady Angelica was scheming severely and secretly also. Oh, had Alda once seen my beautiful Prince Rosa Bocca, was ever her meditation, when she walked alone, I could never have a moment's peace. Dainty had been the letter, slipped into her long furred sleeves by this ardent cavalier, so eminent for his melancholy visage, and his sorrowful coloured suit, and his shoes with peaked toes, which pierced her heart. He, too, had knelt near her at Mass, The sisters never prayed together, and had plucked for her many a chaplet of roses, for her adorning, with every flower offering some of those soft, solemn words to which resistance there is none. And subtly had she, too, spread the lure, and threatened him with a suspicious and watchful sister, and a tyrannical father, and shocking Graf Alberic with his grey beard. There is a terrace in the gardens of the Silver Palace, by this time grievously neglected, to the foot of which a gondola could conveniently be brought. By starlight on Friday evening were the last words which had passed between them on the occasion of its mention, after which were Echo, a babbler of the partings of lovers, she must have told of a kiss. Thank my woman's wit, said the Lady Angelica, it hath delivered me from Graf Alberic. Poor sister Alda, I declare I wish her well. The time was sunset, such as sunset Italy only can show. You might have thought that the belfry of Our Lady's Church, whence the echo of evening chimes was still quivering, was carved out of amethyst, not common stone, and that the fair statues round about the western front were each one a great golden image. The air was full of the scents of jessamine and orange blossoms and late roses, and there might already be heard tinklings under the windows of houses where beauties were known to abide, and sometimes a laugh, or a few notes touched on a lute in answer. Here and there in the porch of some monastery might be seen the bald front of an ancient monk or so, as transgressing he leaned forth to breathe that perfumed air, or to take a wistful peep at the world without, while the guests and the hosterie lingered to listen a while longer to the ballad monger, or to look at another of the wandering ballerina's measures, for who would hurry home on such a night? One wayside inn I know of was that evening crowded. To be sure it was always well filled with guests, for who was in such good renown for thrift and civil words as Monaparetti the hostess? Or where was there as pretty a damsel to be seen, and chaste and modest as pretty as Diana her ward? Or how could gallant be more blithely served to his horse, or his supper with a witty tale, or a smart saying, while his foot was in the stirrup, or while he was draining the last drops from the flask, than by the black-eyed, well-limbed, shrewd Simplicio, the widow's son? On that pleasant night, however, Diana was something short of her share of the sunshine. What can all this closeting mean, mother? She said, in the tapestry parlor, between Simplicio and those two ancient gentlemen, that he refuses to reply when I ask, and heeds not if I look angry, nay, and when I wept just now, laughed in my face, and bade me not be curious. I know not, darling, was Monaparetti's answer, more discreet than true, but wipe thine eyes, and be not fearful. Simplicio is a good lad, and has been thy true bachelor these 3 years next posh time. Let him not fancy thee curious or jealous. They are all calling for another flask of muscadel. I must be gone. Jealous, murmured Diana, looking after that nimble woman. Then she doth know of cause. I never named to her that I was jealous. Simplicio, here the youth came forth, with as pleasant a face as if he had that instant earned a purse of gold. Hast thou never a moment for me? Not a second, Paquina, cried the youth, gaily, stopping further reproach in a wise which would console any maiden, were she ever so petulant. Go thy ways within. There is my mother run off her feet with those hungry merchants from Turin, and yonder is the friar Cherubino from Vallombrosa, who must needs keep his chamber alone. Go and see that he lacks nothing, my pretty Diana, and bid him teach thee a cure for curiosity till tomorrow or the morn after. Nay, I will not away with that pouting, and I am already waited for. And ere she could resist or again beseech him to stay, Simplicio was out of the courtyard. She ran to the gate, shading the sun from her eyes with her hand to see which way he went, but there were many garden walls round about the inn, and a large elm or two, which, being hung with vines, were ample enough to hide 2 men stouter than Simplicio, had it been needful. In short, he had altogether vanished. "Poor little Diana," laughed the youth, as he strode away across the plain, half out of breath with his escape. "Well, a necklace of coral, or a satin petticoat, for the festa will soon bring matters round with her. She is a forgiving child, and so fond of me. And now for my proud beauty of the Silver Palace. What if she should have cared for me after all, and not for the Prince Armonia Giocoso? Fie, the girl who could tell a lie about her father's death will not much regard the plain Simplicio Peretti, and she was won so very easily." And with that he laughed merrily anew. The Lady Rosalie Count Edgar came to woo. His speech was bold and free, his mantle it was new, and he thought himself so fair, no maid his glance might dare. Ah, wandering youths, beware, lest you believe so too. The lady from on high looked far across the mead, and saw the knight draw nigh upon his prancing steed. Her hair with flowers she tied, and laughed to see his pride. Ah, youths, that wooing ride, of such a laugh take heed. He knelt before her feet, and swore her eye was bright, and that her voice was sweet as music heard by night. Ah, sweet, thy smilings show, rare gems shall bind thy brow. If thou wilt hear my vow, thy Edgar woos aright. "Sister Angelica," cried a shrill voice from a window above the terrace on which the maiden was walking, singing like a nightingale, "why must thou be abroad at so late an hour?" "Late, Alda, and the moon not up? No fear have I of cramps or pains. The air refreshes me. 'Twill be my last evening here," she added to herself. "Oh, when were hours ever so long? Would that tomorrow were come!" And again she uplifted her voice. The knight departed mute. The maiden stole unseen, to where a well known lute rang through the thicket green, and soon a gentle strain was heard from voices twain. "Ah, well, thou wooest in vain, where true love once hath been." "What can all, Angelica?" said the Lady Alda, who had by this time also descended, "that she is restless, and will not abide in her chamber this evening. Well, it matters little now. The Prince Armonia Giocoso is constant. What he seems to be, I dare be sworn. No common man, no traitor in love, could have that gallant air. Hark, were those his horse's feet already?" And she sped down a walk, cradled with vines, toward the arch, which, as I have said, overhung the river. "Whither so fast?" Sister Alda called a shrill voice close behind her. It might have been the owl's, for she shook with fear, and turned not to reply to it. "Whither so fast?" repeated her fleeter footed sister, now close at her ear, and decked out in all thy bravery. "What means it?" "Oh, sister, sister, fare thee well," cried the Lady Alda, making a great show of tenderness, as naught better was to be done. "I am waited for. I am—" "What? Art thou going to leave me?" cried the Lady Angelica. "Unkind, cruel, traitoress, to have concealed thy mind from me. Thank my good stars," said she to herself, still hanging on her sister's arms, and weeping as if in sore despair, "that there is in store for me the sweet Prince Rosaboca. Prettily else had I been deserted." But Lady Alda pressed on, invited by the distinct plashing sound of a horse's feet in the water, and scarcely able to keep in the tender ejaculations which rose to her lips. She was soon at the arch. He was there. Santa Maria, how deliciously attired! And his horse, too, was caparisoned, fit to carry a king. "Ah, take care, take care!" cried the maiden tenderly, afraid for his buskins. "I fear me the water is deep." "Heed not, sweetest," cried the youth, and then murmured to himself, "Were the horse not a borrowed one, would I ride so easily? Well, I shall not have the grooming of him to morrow morning, and thou art ready? Exquisite punctuality! Ah, it is only the false who loiter. And who is that maiden beside thee? For methinks there be two of you." "No one, nothing, my bower woman," was the Lady Alda's reply, making the while a great show of affection to the Lady Angelica, who wept more than it is thought she might have done had she heard the whole. "Now, I prithee, dearest child, come with me no further. We must part. I will write. I will send thee a lock of mine hair, sweetest, faithfulest friend. Alas, my prince, the wall is very high." But for all that, in 1 second more, she was in his arms, he screening his face, the while he looked up to her as he could, which was not hard to do, inasmuch as the twilight shadows were falling, and that quickly. Indeed, had he worn a visor, he could not have passed away keeping his features more entirely strange to the Lady Angelica, who, as she stole home, was never tired of repeating to herself, "Who could have thought it? Ride behind him on his horse, like a common vintager's wife. Some mean fellow dressed out in tawdry clothes, I warrant him. But it serves her justly. Fie upon all such deceit." Meanwhile the two, having quitted the river's margin, were making haste across the plain, the horse bearing his part as a spirited minister, as if indeed behind them had been, what the Lady Alda professed to dread, a prying sister and a cruel father. For a mile neither spoke much. It may be because deep love, in its first instance of rapture, is always silent. It may be because the Prince Harmonia Giocoso was wondering what fantasy could make a maiden desirous to be stolen away, when there was none from whom to steal her. Ye have guessed his true name, I see already. "Faster, faster," cried the Lady Alda at last, when the speed of Saladin, careless though his burden was fair, began to abate a little. "Care you not, dearest prince, lest we should be overtaken?" The prince made no answer, and the Lady Alda urged him again, a little louder, for with all her sweet looks, there were times when her voice would make itself heard, and now she was fearful of not being run away with fast enough. "There is as much fear of thy being pursued, my bright Lady Alda," replied the cavalier, "as there is truth in—" "Thou wouldst not already say, truth in thy love?" was the tender interruption; for though sure of his reply, like other maidens I have heard of, the Lady Alda was anxious to hear the same. "Thou wouldst not already declare that thou art wearied of thy charge? Ah, man, man!" and with that she fetched a few very tender sighs. But the answer came not, whereupon she pressed for it again, in that sharper tone of hers. "What new falsehood wouldst say, my prince?" "Simply," spoke out the youth, his eye glancing keenly athwart the plain as though he sought something, "simply that there is as much fear of thy being pursued as there is truth in my princeship. Diamond hath cut diamond. Thy father, the Count Magliano, deceased a 12 months since. Thy sister, who did ill not to peep over the wall just now, is about to try her fortune with my patron's friend, the Prince Rosobocca, whose groom oftentimes have I been, plain Simplicio Peretti being my name, the son of the hostess of Our Lady of the Cherries. I have heard of many storms, of earthquakes also, but never were either so dreadful as the Lady Alda's wrath upon this goodly revelation being made to her. Violent were her words, terrible to hear her menaces. Set me down, wretch, set me down, I say. Oh, if there be law in Italy, or women left, thou shalt rue this audacity. The Marquis Ojeda shall hear of it. "I hope so," said Simplicio, wiping his forehead with his cuff as he took the disenchanted damsel at her word, and assisted her to alight. "And yonder he sits in his coach to redress your wrongs, fairest lady. Had he trifled less with his suit, there had been no need of my ministry. I judge that now you will hardly desire to return unwed to the Silver Palace." And as he spoke, the chariot door was opened, and with a parting kiss upon her hand, nimbly given, to escape the cuff her fingers tingled to bestow the faithless Prince Harmonia Giocoso, delivered the Lady Alda into the staid keeping of the squinting Spanish Marquis. 50 golden crowns won, and this rare suit, laughed Simplicio, as he rode across the plain, and as much tomorrow from Graf Alberic. O Diana, Diana, thou mayest well afford a little heartache, who art so soon to be so sumptuously dowered, and so merrily wedded. It was the second morning after the Lady Alda's wedding that the Marquis Ojeda, a little wondering what had become of some of her charms, stole forth and left his young wife at home, planning new robes and furniture, and marvellously set upon a plume which she would have the old gentleman buy, because it had been refused as too costly by no less a personage than the Queen of Cyprus. The Lady Alda, truth to say, for all she was so lately wedded, lacked company, her sister to wrangle with, or news, to discover whether, indeed, there was any truth in what that audacious fellow had declared concerning the Lady Angelica, and some Prince Rosaboca or other. All at once she hears a voice in the antechamber. "Why, it is Angelica," exclaims she, "come to mock me with her younger bridegroom." And willingly would she have shrunk behind the arras, but she was Count Giambattista's daughter, and accordingly she stiffened herself up, and prepared to express much contentment in the nuptial state, opened the door, and one stood there, half pale, half red, but wondrously richly dressed. It was Angelica. "Where's the Marquis? I would see the Marquis. Poor gentleman, how he will take it to heart when he finds his old comrade married, and he still a bachelor. Ah, Sister Alda, Sister Alda, what do you hear?" "What my lord's loving wife ought to do," was the other's reply, swallowing her envy as best she might. "And how doth the Prince Rosaboca? Knowest thou aught of that?" "Listen. It was thy unkindness, and hiding from me thy resolve to marry the Spanish lord, that drove me to think of the wretch. I declare it was. I loved him not. And even when he came last evening to fetch me away with his gondola, as was appointed, he hath a marvellously courtly look in that dark suit, the impostor. Oh, I say, when I came down the west terrace for the last time, he leading me, and soothing me ever so sweetly the while, and swearing the stars were dim, not because they disdained to light us, but because my two eyes shamed them. I tell thee I felt a doleful foreboding, and I would fain have tarried, but he hurried me along. It was my Graf Alberic's impatience." Warmly did the Lady Alda, embracing her, interrupt the Lady Angelica's recital. "Kiss me, sweetest sister, and let us be friends again. I know all. We have both been tricked, but may we deserve to be doubted for no daughters of the Count Giambattista Magliano, rest his soul, if we do not visit it upon our husbands. Heaven be thanked, man is mortal, and an old man especially so. Now I shall be asked, bright ladies and gentlemen, whether these sisters of the Silver Palace kept their vow, but I know no more of their history, save that the Lady Alda was in turn cut short by a great noise below, the zampani and dulcimers, and merry boys and girls shouting, and the ambling of mules' feet. "What meaneth that uproar, Marquis?" inquired she of her spouse, who entered ere she could inquire. "Is my castle garden turned into an osteria already?" And he answered quietly, "It is the wedding train of Diana, Monna Paretti's ward, and Simplicio her son. Were it not for my stiff neck, I would open the window that ye might hear. So merry a ballad some of them are singing, and the burden is, Ah, wealth, thou wooest in vain, where true love once hath been." "'Tis an inevitable chance, the first statute in Magna Carta, an everlasting act of Parliament. All must die." End of section 1. Section 2 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 7, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 2. Hans in Kelder, A Legend of the Great Frost. O roving muse, recall that wondrous year, when winter reigned in bleak Britannia's air, when hoary Thames with frosted osiers crowned was 3 long moons in icy fetters bound, the waterman forlorn along the shore pensive reclines upon his useless oar. Sea-harnessed steeds desert the stony town, and wander roads unstable, not their own. Wheels o'er the hardened water smoothly glide, and raise with whitened tracks the slippery tide. Here the fat cook piles high the blazing fire, and scarce the spit can turn the steer entire. Booths sudden hide the Thames, long streets appear, and numerous games proclaim the crowded fair. Gay. Italy has its yearly carnivals, and Holland and Russia can boast of the splendor, durability, and extent of the annual fairs and assemblies upon their frozen waters. In modern London, however, such gay scenes are almost entirely unknown, except when a winter of unusual severity freezes up her Thames and makes it, for a brief season, emulate the icy rivers of Belgium itself. But while such occurrences are so rare as to stand prominently out from the file of ordinary events, many of the more common ancient civic disports have also entirely departed this life, and exist only in our old chronicles, or in those romances which picture out the manners of London's vanished days. For much of this abridgment of our mirth we may thank the Puritans, and modern refinement and wisdom have nearly swept away the little which they left. Where, I pray you, be our May games? Why, gone with the famous Maypole of St. Andrew undershaft, which that fierce zealot, Sir Stephen, the curate of Cree Church, preached down, and had sawn into pieces for firewood, as Stowe tells us. Where is now the glorious sight of the midsummer watch on the eve of St. John, when glass lamps, flowers, and green herbs decked the streets through which it passed? It ceased even against Elizabeth's express command, from a want of the same ancient spirit which inspired it in the time of Henry VIII. Where be the brave processions of archers and their trials of skill in the suburbs of London? Alas, their glory, set in the great shooting match in Finsbury in 1583, and Charles I tried in vain to revive it. But if I should separately recount all the features of decay, time would indeed fail me. Our costly pageants are unknown, our splendid mummings are ended. The youths of London no longer contend with sword and buckler after evening prayer, nor do the maidens play on their timbrels and dance in the presence of their masters and dames for garlands suspended across the streets. All these are past, and London, in its magnificent, its simple, and its innocent pastimes, is no more. One scene, however, in which the city yet bears a considerable resemblance to its former days, is when the Thames is frozen over, when tents are erected, and various sports are carried on upon its surface. Some instances have occurred even in our own times which convey to us a good conception of those of centuries past. And now, if the reader will only look back with me for 142 years from this present January in the year of human redemption 1843, I will depict in as lively features as I may a legend of that great frost which characterized the closing reign of King Charles II. It was during the winter of the year 1683 that a tall man of a foreign aspect, a most cadaverous countenance, and a torn ancient habit, expressive of the greatest poverty, engaged a lonely and miserable hovel, seated on the worst part of the bankside by the river Thames. As he placed in the hands of his landlord a sum amounting to the full worth of the building for ever, he was allowed to take up his residence without many inquiries, and the only information elicited from him was that he had spent most of his life abroad, where he had acquired the Dutch title of Hans in Kelder, or Jack in the cellar, from his habits of retirement. When he did engage himself in any occupation, it was as an herbalist to the apothecaries, in whose service he frequently absented himself whole days from home. As the good people of England found at this period abundance to talk of in the public events that were daily occurring, Master Hans was for some time left to enjoy his Kelder in quietness, but as he neither discovered plots nor plotted himself, minded only his own concerns, was no gossiper, and did not frequent either the convivial parties or the Puritan meeting-houses around him, his neighbours began to think that he must be little better than one of the wicked, simply because he so slightly resembled themselves. His character was the more misrepresented in proportion to the distance at which it was canvassed. Thus he was shrewdly doubted at the Puritan ale-house, entitled The God Encompasseth Us, or as some called it, either from waggery or brevity, the Goat and Compasses, on the Bankside. He was openly suspected at the Lamb and Leather breaches in the Borough, and at the Pedlar and his pack on London Bridge. He was actually denounced by the discordant names of Whig, Papist, Puritan, Prophet, Madman, and Wizard. However, he contrived to live through it all, and as he drank only water, he kept himself alike free from the scores of knavish publicans and the inquiries of multitudes of inquisitive sinners. But to speak the plain truth, there certainly were some points in his life really calculated to excite somewhat more than mere vulgar curiosity. He had never been known to cross the bridge into the city since his first coming to dwell on the Bankside, and his diet was of so ascetic a nature that none could ever discover anything like ordinary food going into his house. Manchet, the Puritan baker who lived at the sign of the Golden Shoe Bread over against the bridge gate, affirmed that he must be little better than a Hebrew Jew who did not eat the same bread as his neighbours, and added something about the leaven of unrighteousness. H. Bone, the butcher, too, who resided in that market which until about 70 years past occupied the middle of the main street of the borough, swore stoutly that a man who loved not his trencher must be worse than a Turk, and ought to be sent to grass like King Nebuchadnezzar. Another worthy of the same sagacious and disinterested class was also enraged at the quiet and inoffensive Hans in Kelder. This was Master Saunders Spluchen, a Scots tobacconist and tavern-keeper of London Bridge, the eleve and successor of the late Master Shortcut of the tobacco roll and flagon, to whose sign the witty King James added the classical but quibbling motto of Eo Bacchi. Now Master Saunders considered within himself that he, of all others, had a right to be angered at the recluse's neglect of his wares, for, thought he, and he thought it aloud, and in broad Scotch, say the loon were a wee bit a papist, whilk is no muckle to be doubted, yet the reek o' gude Virginny tobacco is free to ilka sect in this modern Babel o' London. For years straight war Puritan taxed in his meeting-house, and ear-swithering loons they ca' Quakers fuff it away in their dumb assemblies, and ear organ-loving Episcopalian fills his pouch with the best Oronuco, and ear image-worshipping Tycha the Pape does nae scorn to mak his pipe reek like a killick. For my own part, I say love to moralize the Indian weed or a tankard o' my ain October that the good wife I think some foo when I've emptied only a short English quart stoup or tway. And I shouldn't wonder if the good wife's very much in the right. Master Saunders, he, ha, ho, said a pompous, rough voice behind the reflecting tobacconist. Now this voice belonged to no less a personage than the worshipful Master Democritus Overcrow, the beadle of St. Magnus Church, London Bridge. He was a fine specimen of the ancient city parish officer, overbearing alike in his wisdom and his wit. In all matters and in all companies he was desirous of being the prime mover, principal agent, and centre of gravity. If the debate were serious, he spake long and loudly. If the conversation were jocular, he was still long and still loud, garnishing his discourse with sly witticisms and dull jokes of his own, to which he was particularly addicted, when he relaxed his conceited features to a laugh. Lest his hearers, however, should presume upon this freedom, he would bridle up his mouth with that full and pursy titter which usually characterizes your wealthy and important busybody. It's very like Master Saunders, said this worthy pillar of St. Magnus, that the good wife, as you call her, is quite right about your moralizing with a pipe and tankard. She's afraid you should be too moral, righteous overmuch, you know. He, ha, ho. What's yer wool? Answered Saunders, putting on his most stupid look that he might have time to collect his thoughts. 'Twaypun a mild pudding, did ye say? What's yer wool? Wool, man, replied Overcrow. Thou art truly wool-gathering. He, ha, ho. I was saying that your good wife, why do you call her so? We've no good wives in England. He, ha, ho. My certie, Maester Overcrow, and is it yersel? Ejaculated the wily tobacconist, as if he had then for the first time discovered his visitor. Come away, man, will ye, intil the parlour. I hae gotten a thing to tell ye of that's a muckle concern till the parish. Come away, come away. As they entered, Saunders pointed out to his guest through the window of his small back room, which overhung the western side of London Bridge, and looked up the Thames, the tents and fair which were then erected upon the ice, for this scene took place in the January of 1683-4. Ay, said Overcrow, that's blanket fair, standing on a sheet of ice over the bed of the river. He, ha, ho. Direful frost this, Master Splutter. Sploochen, will ye favour? Interrupted the tobacconist. I kenned it wad be a long and sour frost, but we'll cry up a tankard, Maester Democroc, and then I'll tell ye my story. Do so, Splutter, and if thine ale be good, I'll cry up the tankard. He, ha, ho. And when the beverage was produced and the two worthies of St. Magnus were seated by a blazing fire, Saunders Sploochen thus began his legend. Ye maun ken, Maester Bedrell, that the lave chalmers of these biggings are in the piers of this muckle auld brig. Lay chambers, interrupted Overcrow. What be they, friend Splutter? The bedrooms, I should guess by their name. He, ha, ho. Nay, wi' yer favour, sir, they are no the bedrooms, but the cellars, where the wee winnocks look out upon the river and the braid flats o' wood that the folks call the Starlings. Weel, Maester Democritus, friend Splutter, you mean Democritus, again interrupted Overcrow. Ay, weel, I'm sure I said Democroc, answered the tobacconist, and I'm sure ye might take yer ain tale hame and cae me Sploochen instead of Splutter, whilk is but a sorry kind of title, ye ken. Albeit, Maester Bedrell, in one of the rooms we keepeth the ale barrel, and you'll find it a good broust wi' a double strake of malt in it. So ye see that when I take the solace of a pipe of leaf tobacco after the fash of the day is o'er. I get me a pint stoop to moisten it withal, or it may be tway, but it's in sobriety. Now ye see that ane night in the beginning of this frost, when we'd a fresh browst in, I was fain to taste it, to ken whether it was good, and sae I went down by mysel' wi' the tankard in my hand, whilst the moon was shining through the winnock, and glinted bonnily on the spigot. A bitter cauld night it was, mair by token that I tasted the yill mair than once, but ye're no to think I was fou. I think ye full, Master Splutter, exclaimed Overcrow. No, God save the mark, I think you can't be full. He, ha, ho. Weel, Master Bedraw, when I found that the yill was good, as I was coming back, I heard a sort of an eldritch crooning, and on looking through the winnock, there stood on one of the starlings about a cat's loop baff me, a fearsome looking child of a mighty age, wi' a beard as long as an ell-wand, and rapid in his white dead claes, swithering and quaking in the cold moonlight. It was nae time then to be thinking of the yill, for I kenned I'd seen either the Dell or Jack Frost, but though I tried to cost up a bit prayer or spell, I gaed ane lusty scritch and cowpit on the ground, o'erturning the barrel as I fell, and so lay in a dwam till the gudewife and her quean came down to lift me. Weel, sir, ye wadna think it, but as they found me lying with the empty pint stoop and the yill running aboot the floor, drunken tyke was the best word in their wame, for the bogey had vanished, and they wadna believe that I'd been flayed by ony ghaist at and no one has seen it since. No, friend, I dare say not, replied Overcrow, and they thought belike that you should have been flayed by a constable at the bridge watch-house. He, ha, ho. My certie, ejaculated the tobacconist, and wasna siccan a terrible revelation enough without the mocking of two jauds like Job's wife and the deil baith clawing on me at once. Why truly, neighbour Splutter, said the beadle, these are not sights for an orderly parish like ours, which is governed by officers of such gravity. And now we're upon it, there's another iniquity which it behooves us of the legality to inquire into, for on the bankside there dwells a fellow who calls himself Sams in a skelter or some such ungodly name, and he continued, shaking his head, there be plotters abroad, you know. Vera true, Maister Bedrell, vera true, rejoined Spluchin. And to speak my mind to him, I think that he's nae better than a wizard or an evil spirit, for he does nae smoke. For with smoke ye ken, Raphael drave away the evil spirit from the daughter of Raguel, whilk ye may read in Tobit the 8th and 2nd. No, Splutter, it's no such thing, I tell you, said the beadle, but we of the legality, the plurables of the parish, think that he's a spy, or some part of the late plots. Let him have a care, though. Let him have a care, for there's a spring laid for him that he'll hardly scape, and he were in truth an evil spirit. Let it go no farther on his friend, but as it's known that he's somewhere on the ice every night, he'll be watched for and made to give a better account of himself than by saying Sam's in a skelter, I warrant you. The celebrated frost, which overspread the Thames at the time that this conversation took place, was one of the longest and severest in the history of London. From the beginning of December 1683 until the 5th of the February following, the river was so completely frozen from London Bridge to Westminster that another city was erected on the ice and furnished with all the commodities, carriages, festivities, and entertainments which were to be found upon its banks. This British carnival was known by the name of Blanket Fair, and its principal scene of merriment was nearly opposite the Temple Stairs. A double line of small square tents, stretching from the water gate of that building almost straight across the river, was called Temple Street, and another running nearly parallel with the Surrey shore was named Thames Street, both of which were decorated with gay signs, garlands, and taverners' bushes, intimating that food, wine, fire, and amusements of all sorts were to be found within. In that part of the river which was not occupied by tents, the ice generally lay in large irregular masses, with occasional fractures showing the water below, having a board placed over them, and a waterman standing on each side to collect the toll from such as passed across it. In several places, however, a space had been cleared for a bear, bait, or bull running, or the erection of printing presses, which, Evelyn observes, were said to gain £5 a day for the printing of names only. There were also gaming tables, public fires, whirly coats, and that important feature of all great frosts on the Thames, the roasting of an entire ox over an iron pan, which stood upon the ice. Around each of these exhibitions was collected a very fair specimen of the vulgar of the days of King Charles II, some being in attendance from a natural love of brutal pastimes, others from the frost affording a plausible excuse for their very great inclination to idleness, others from the hope of finding an easy prey for their knavery to play upon, others from their attachment to stray purses, and all from an innate propensity to mischief. Beyond this part of the fair, and nearer to the shore, was a stand of various kinds of carriages, ready to seize upon visitors at their first entering upon the river, some being shaped like cars, or the cabriolet of the present day, and others consisting of the ordinary heavy hackney coaches of the 17th century. As one of the days of this fair was drawing to a close, a tall, hard-featured man, with black hair, was seen advancing from Westminster toward the tents which stood by the bank-side. He was met and accosted by a good-looking person, of a remarkably free and cavalier-like air, with a singular habit of striding as he walked, clothed in rather an antique military costume, which seemed to be rather the worse for wear, either from its continual duty, or perhaps from the very hard service which it had seen in the wars. In short, the whole of his appearance indicated one of those military men who were thrown out of employ at the Restoration, with but limited means of support, yet, though he strove to cover his poverty by an air of levity and mirth, the brave soldier and the honourable man were evident through all. "The good time of the evening to you, sir," said the soldier. "You are visiting Blanket Fair, I presume. Trust me, sir, a merry sight, and a goodly, for I take it upon my credit to say to you that there be persons of excellent fashion therein. A wide step at this place. Witty gentlemen, sir, and valiant, most of them mine intimates, for we have served together." An enormous stride followed this speech. "Indeed, sir, I shall desire your company ere we part, over a pottle of burnt sack, and it stand to your liking. And I pray you, sir, to be choice in your comrades, for there be knaves in yonder fair. Smite me, sir, there be knaves in it." And his address concluded with a third immense stride. "Truly, sir," replied the tall stranger, with somewhat of sarcasm in his voice, "truly, I doubt not that you are well qualified to speak touching the knavery of the place. And seeing that I came to look on some of the sports, I shall think myself happy in your escort where I may best partake of them. I would gladly bestow a quart of canaries, or what you will, to have that courtesy." "My most honoured friend," cried the soldier in ecstasy, "I shall desire leave speedily to embrace you. I saw from the first that you were a gentleman, discovered it with half an eye, sir, none of your swaggering troopers, astride at this place, as if to give effect to his words, who tramped the ice for dinner. Spike me, no, sir, but a gentleman, sir, a real gentleman." And he finished with a long step as before. "And by what title may I accost you, sir?" asked the first stranger of his companion. "I'm a poor captain of Rupert's, sir," replied he with some feeling. "Now the wars are over, and the king back again, thrown aside with other rusty armour. My name is Hannibal Corslet, and I led a troop of horse under the most valiant Prince Rupert, who hath often bestowed favours on me with his own hand in the field. But that shall pass. For mine house and family, they are of the famous Stradello in Italy, and for that I have an unconfined and martial step. My comrades were wont to call me Captain Straddle, though I certify you that it was but in honourable jocoseness. And for your peculiar title—" "For me," replied the first speaker with some hesitation, "you may call me Hans in Kelder. 'Tis a name I travelled with in Holland." "Ha!" cried Captain Corslet, "then you have seen the Belgic line and Jack Dutchman. Sir, I honour you for your experience. And now, as the evening is closing, I deem that you will not desire yet to look upon the sports, but rather go into some honest tavern to recruit. What say you, sir? Here is the Royal Oak, and I'll assure you that you shall drink worse French wine than they draw within." "I attend you, captain," said Hans, "for I have found the Royal Oak prove a good shelter ere now. and our two heroes entered the tent. The interior of the tavern presented but little room and few and coarse accommodations. On one side a large fire was supported on an iron stand, and a brass lamp, which blazed fiercely in the centre, served to show some half-dozen persons seated near a rude table covered with tankards, tall Venice glasses, and various kinds of flasks and bottles. By the fire sat a stout man in a sailor's habit, who seemed, from the sarcastic ferocity of his features and the arms which he carried, to be of the rudest class of pirates, though few would have ventured to ask him the question. Several strangers, with the landlord of the Royal Oak, his drawers and their liquors, filled the remainder of the tavern. "Good even to ye all, gentlemen," said the captain, striding into the tent and touching his hat. "Give ye good even. Guten Abend, as your Almain hatheth. Here, Jenkins' drawer," he continued, seating himself and stretching out his legs, "has good canaries and claret, boy, eh? The best on the river, so please you," said the tapster, taking up a tankard. "Then do me thine office quickly, fill me a quart of sack, and burn it. Let the jug cream and mantle like the snow wreath of the Switzer's mountains. Ho, 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 since life is full of woe, let the glass be filled again. Ho, ho, ho." "Well done, Captain, your mirth becomes you," said Master Hans, taking a seat in the circle. "Here's a health to you. Sir, you make me proud. But what saith the proverb? A merry heart is worth gold, and fortune could never rob me of that. And now, gentlemen, speaking of fortune reminds me of war. When I was in the army under Prince Rupert, he was a commander of such unmatchable courage that he galloped to battle with as much speed as if he rode to a banquet." "Ay," rejoined the landlord, "and the story runs that there was a song known to many of his officers by the name of Rupert's Hymn. I would e'en give a tankard of claret but to hear it." "Order up the claret, landlord, and open your ears then," answered Corselet. "I'll give it you as we sang it at the grand charge at Naseby field in 1645, only you must think that the sound of the kettle drums and trumpets and the chorus of the whole troops made it more spirit-stirring than we shall hear it again. Mount, gallants, mount, for the rays of the morning are gilding your arms on the tent-covered plain. Mount, gallants, mount, for the day that is dawning must shine on us victors, or shine on us slain. Mount, cavaliers, it is loyalty speeds you. Mount, cavaliers, it is Rupert who leads you. Mount, cavaliers, let the flag which precedes you be covered with blood or with glory again. Draw, gallants, draw, on the enemy dashing full on his ranks, irresistibly pour. On, gallants, on, when the sabres are flashing, remember King Charles, and remember no more. On, cavaliers, it is vengeance that speeds you. On, cavaliers, it is Rupert who leads you. On, cavaliers, let the flag which precedes you be covered with glory or covered with gore." While these verses were singing, the features of Master Hans began to lose their harshness as they became flushed and animated by the song, and he at length joined in the rushing tide of the chorus with as much ardour as if he had that moment had his foot in the stirrup on the field of Naseby, with the royal army in full charge behind him. The applause and excitement produced by this song had not subsided when a pompous voice was heard exclaiming at the door, "Make way there, good people, make way for us of the legality, who are come to look for hidden enormities. We've warrant for that we do, as shall be manifested," and immediately entered our old acquaintance Overcrow, followed by several watchmen. The beadle cast a scrutinizing glance around the tent, which rested chiefly upon the stout sailor, the captain, and his companion Hans. "Pierce, posset," said Overcrow to one of the watchmen, "guard the door, and Cresset, hold up the lantern whilst I consult mine intelligencer. I promise you, my masters, some of ye look like knaves that I like not, and it shall go hard but it be proved so ere we depart. I'm in search of," he continued, looking on a paper, "of a long-bodied, dark hair, foreign-looking," and then addressing himself to the stranger, he added, "And pray, friend, how may you be named?" "You may call me Hansen Kelder," was the answer. "Nay, and you call yourself so? That's now for me, and so I promise to show you the inside of the brig watch house to-night, Master Hans, for you are known to be a knave." "Not without my consent," replied the stranger coolly. "Nor without mine neither," added Captain Corselet, "for this gentleman came hither with me, and straff mich hell, as Jack German says, if I see him captured without a blow. Fellow, said Overcrow, this must be answered to your superiors, but you shall be dealt with anon, for we of the legality are not to be bullied in the discharge of our ministry. And turning to the sailor, he added, and who may you be, Master Mariner? The devil, replied the sailor, starting from his seat, and speaking in a harsh, deep tone. At this the valiant Overcrow at first recoiled a few steps, but recovering himself answered, Then I charge the watch with you in the name of King Charles and St. Magnus the Martyr. But give us your name, fellow. We are not to be scared by your bullying. Hark ye, brother, said the mariner, completely rousing himself. When we sailors are asked for names we don't care to own to. We call the ship Hans and Kelder. So, do you see me now? Be content with a civil answer, and sheer off while the play is good. Oh, it's a plot, I see, exclaimed Overcrow. There's a villain of the name in every parish, and there'll be old firing of London again. Who was it spake of firing London? Cried the sailor, starting up in frenzy. Who said that I threw the first fireball, and immediately rushed out of the tavern? In the very height of the surprise which this occasioned, Saunders Spluchen burst into the tent, his face pale and his hair standing on end with fright, exclaiming, Come away! If ye are Christian folk, come away, for there's the devil himself on the Starlings, a London bridge, greeting like a crocodile, and rampaging like a fighting dragon, and this is the twasome time that I hae see him. As I have never seen him once, said Captain Corselet, I'll even go now, so show me the way, my bonny Scot. And notwithstanding the exclamations of Overcrow, the whole party rushed out. The Bankside and London Bridge were, during the great frost, the most lonely and unfrequented parts of the crowded surface of the Thames, for the tents and streets did not come up close to either, and in 1683 there were several robberies committed about those places, especially upon such passengers as were so incautious as to say, with the travellers in Shakespeare's Henry IV, that they would, along with company, having great charge. It was to this gloomy and silent spot that the visitors of the Royal Oak now rapidly crowded, but ere they could reach it, the report of a pistol, followed by a faint cry, quickened both their steps and their curiosity. The evening had by this time grown quite dark, and from the occasional lights which glanced up and down in the houses upon London Bridge and the Bankside, it was evident that the graver inhabitants were retiring to rest. The edifice itself rose in a dark, heavy mass above the whitened river, forming a strong contrast to the ruddy glare with which the distant fires of blanket fare had tinted the night skies, and the cold light that the wintry moon had cast upon the ice. On one of the starlings of the bridge nearest the Surrey shore, a figure in white was seen lying apparently lifeless, with the head hanging over toward the water. My certie, exclaimed Spluchen, when this scene presented itself, the deil be in me if they hae nae shot the ghaist for the sake o' his mort claes. There's more knavery in it than that, friend Scott, replied Captain Corselet. Hark, he groans. Gentlemen, the poor wretch is yet living. Such of ye as are valiant and willing, come with me, and perchance we shall yet save him. Upon this he rushed forward, and with some difficulty mounted the high starling by the blocks of ice which lay around it. But scarcely had he ascended it when he found himself seized by a powerful grasp, which the glimmering light discovered to be that of the pirate sailor who had so hastily quitted the Royal Oak. Hola, comrade, cried the captain, let go your hold. We must save the dying man before you. Yourself shall be the dying man then, replied the sailor, unless you quit us both. I carry 2 men's lives at my girdle, and by the fiend of darkness one of them shall be yours rather than you shall have my secret. Gentlemen, exclaimed Corselet, taking a firm hold upon the mariner, and loudly calling out to his party, which was now increased by several persons bearing flambeaux, gentlemen, make up in the name of God and King Charles, for here's a villain and a secret, worth a king's ransom, rather worth a nation's eternal curse, said the figure in white, recovering and speaking in a faint voice. The reply to this was another pistol discharged by the mariner. Though his arms being arrested by Corselet, the contents were lodged in his own body, which rolled off the starling under the arch of the bridge, where the tide was unfrozen, and immediately sank beneath the ice. Is he gone? Exclaimed the figure, raising himself and looking wildly after the sailor. Then I must soon follow, and my life is rapidly passing. Nay, attempt not to drag me hence, he continued to several persons who had now ascended the starling, and endeavour to remove him. Seek not to drag me hence, for I will die here and elsewhere. I will reveal nothing, but bear me up for a little. And now listen, all of you. He whose body is now the prey of the waters, and whose soul is gone to its place, was the infernal Hubert Cloudsley, who first fired London, and I was his accomplice. I, well may ye shrink from me, he added, as his supporters, with involuntary horror, let his body fall upon the starling, but ye are all avenged, for even they who lost friends and fortune in that awful burning in the wildest moment of horror were in paradise to me ever since that hour. Never could I again enter the city, but after a restless and wandering life, spent all over the earth, I came to die in penance in sight of my recovering victim. My life is ebbing faster than the tide below me. This night, for the first time since we set London in flames, Hubert and I met, and to preserve the accursed secret he hath gone to his account with another murder. Ever since my return to England, I have nightly, as an act of penitence, clothed myself in my grave clothes, and sat beneath this bridge till the dawn of morning, weeping over my past guilt, and shivering to the night blast. My abode hath been the most wretched hovel of yonder bank, and my ill-gotten wealth has been scattered to every sufferer around me, that their blessings might ascend with the curses of my victims. And now I am departing, bound on a longer and a darker voyage than ever mariner sailed. O London, he continued, making an effort to raise himself and look toward the city, live for ever. Thy name shall rise in glory from thine ashes, while mine shall die accursed and unknown. He uttered these words with all his remaining strength, and his life then forsaking him, he fell backward as the mariner had done, over the starling beneath the bridge. As he sank, however, the shroud blew aside from his face, and Spluchen exclaimed, My certie, the deils keep it a good look out after its ain, for it's the wizard chief they call Hans in Kelder. Ay, said Overcrow, bustling up and laying his hand on the collar of the tall stranger, but we've another rogue here of that name that may swing instead of him, for the legality of the land is not to be defrauded of its prey. Somebody shall be hanged, that I've made up my mind on. Hold there, Master Constable, cried Corselet, leaping down from the starling and seizing the beetle. Less zeal and more wisdom. This is a royalist and a gentleman, and I'm another. And moreover, we've a cup to drink together before we part. That you shall do, answered Overcrow, by being put in ward together, and both taste of the same cup. He, ha, ho. Bring him along, watchman. Come on, fellow. You're mighty unwilling to go to prison, methinks. The force of the beetle's grasp tore open the cloak in which the stranger was enveloped, and discovered upon his breast the silver star of the garter, with its rich jewel suspended by a blue riband about his neck. His hat falling off too at the same moment discovered the full features of Charles II himself, surrounded by the fine dark hair which so strongly characterized him. God save the king, cried Corselet, taking the astonished Overcrow by the collar and giving him a violent swing round. Who is likely to be hanged now, Master Constable? Fear not, said the merry monarch. Magistrate should be a terror to evil-doers, and odds fish, this fellow would terrify a knave with e'er a bailiff in Christendom. But fear not, man, fear not. Death in disguises make all men equals, and this night hath shown us that which kings may well be instructed by. But now let us back to the Royal Oak, and finish our night, Captain, and in the morning you shall have both reward and employment. Believe me, my heart is grateful to all my old offenders, but mine eyes are not all seeing, nor is my treasury without a bottom. Such was one of the romantic occurrences of the great frost in 1683, but although history make no mention of it, yet the extraordinary penance is recorded in a periodical paper of 1757, and impressions are still extant of a bill printed on the ice in the famous frost now described, on which are found the names of all the royal family, one of whom is designated by the singular title of Hans in Kelder. End of section 2.
Section 3 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 7. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 3. Julian and Leonor by R. S. Mackenzie. LLD. Perhaps the greatest value of this anecdote is that it is literally founded upon fact. The circumstances are not wholly unknown in Rome and Venice, nor the dramatis personae in England. Where sea-girt Venice points westwardly into the Adriatic, there is a little lone island, dimly visible from the sandy shore of the Lido, to which the gondolieri may row you in about half an hour. It looks dark and desolate. The stranger's step rarely intrudes upon its loneliness, but it is oftener visited by the Venetians, who turn from the gaiety of the Piazza di San Marco, the revel of the earth, the masque of Italy, to indulge in that lone place, in the melancholy emotions which follow the estro of enjoyment. In the triumphant and stirring times of blind old Dandolo, it was a sort of gathering place for the wild mariners who swept the Adriatic and the Levant with a piratical freedom. They built a dwelling there, in which convenience was consulted rather than architectural beauty, and the place seems well adapted for the rendezvous of these skimmers of the seas. When the flag of St. Mark ceased to be the talisman of power, pomp, pride, and victory, as the prows of Venice swept over the seas with an eagle's arrowy flight, these ocean freebooters also felt decay. The island became deserted, their citadel a ruin, and of late years only did it receive a partial renovation, when it became converted into and used as a laser house, or receptacle for the insane. Among the many inmates of this dreary abode was one whose madness was of a mild and subdued nature. When I learned that he was an Englishman, my curiosity, or it may be a higher and better feeling, became strongly excited. I inquired into the particulars of his story, and the result of this inquisition still more deeply interested me in his fate, while it assured me also that it would not be very difficult to soften his complaint, less of madness than melancholy, its asperities being few and faint, its paroxysms very infrequent. His demeanour exhibited more of a mind warped than erect, and upon all points but one he was fully as rational as one half the world. But I anticipate my tale. It is a sad narrative of a high heart, which brokenly lived on, with all its ardent hopes shattered, and its affections scattered in the dust around it. When I first saw that young Englishman in the Venetian madhouse, he seemed about 30 years of age. Toil and turmoil of the mind had given him a furrowed cheek, for I afterward knew that he wanted some years of his apparent age. He was rich and high-born. He must have been more than usually beautiful, if we may apply the term beautiful to man, for even then the pale shadow of his former self, he was one on whom the eye would involuntarily linger, just as we cannot pass by, with a mere common glance of admiration, some splendid production where the art of the sculptor, Pygmalion-like, has thrown such mind into the marble that it seems as if struggling into the energy of life. From his youth upward he was enthusiastic as the veriest poet, whose mind is so exquisitely formed as to be crushed in contact with the rude world, like some fairy-like piece of exquisite and priceless bijouterie which is fragmented by a slight touch. His imagination had loved to run riot through the asphodel fields of poetic thought before he had filed his mind to the necessity of slaking its thirst at the fresh-welling mountains of solid knowledge. But in time this necessity became self-apparent, and he plunged eagerly into the deep quest of what learning from her ancient scrolls can bestow, or nature scatter forth to the inquirer from her ever open and exhaustless volume of beauty and living action. He drank deeply of the mingled waters of other men's detailed experience and his own dreamy imaginings. The magnificence of this world's external beauty filled him with wild delight. He had become an idealist. Wherever he looked, whatever he beheld, however nature arrayed herself, all ministered to the pleasure of a mind sensitively awake to a keen and quick perception of the beautiful. Like that flower which still turns to the day god as he treads the azure paths of heaven, and folds up her golden petals when his glory retires to gladden other lands, so did his spirit expand as it gazed delightedly on this world we are in and of, and so too, when the dusky twilight of graver thought came on, did it veil its contemplation from the darkness which then surrounded it. For hitherto, although he sometimes paused, even in the full rapidity of his studious course, to wonder at many things, wildering as the Fata Morgana to the Sicilian peasant, his soul remained tranquil in the rapid path he traversed. At length, for it could not long be otherwise, he panted for communings with an intelligence like his own. He sighed for some Egeria in his loneliness. His fancy framed for himself a being bright in charms and beautiful in intelligence. It endowed her with all of fair or wise or wonderful that lover, philosopher, or poet could severally have imaged. He languished for the bright reality of this dear vision which haunted his dreams by night and his thoughts by day, breathing, beautiful and real. And let not this seem strange, for the idealist has endowments which are his own peculiars. All peace, all time, all things become subsidiary to one engrossing thought. I will go forth, thought he, to seek in other lands for that intelligence and beauty which I have vainly quested in my own, in other climes which nature has arrayed in her most magnificent and beautiful hues. There must exist some corresponding human beauty and intellect to match the gorgeousness which rests beneath those far and favored skies. Surely the children of these sunny lands must still be beautiful and gifted as in old days, when they were the poet themes which even now stir the soul of man up from its very depths. He made the tour of Europe, and still was dissatisfied. In France he did not find the creature he sought for. Beautiful women met his eye, wit, lightning-winged, sped from their lips, and they had pretty words, strung like pearls for his ear, smiles which seemed the very arrows of a most hearted love, fascination which, like a whirlpool, drew all admiration into its eddy. But he found or fancied that all was mere show and tinsel. He distrusted the seeming sincerity of heart with which heartlessness can so well invest herself, and he fled in disgust from the calypso wiles of Parisian fashion. It was the same wherever he went. All places lacked the Hesperian fruit he sought. So, as a last resort, he turned his pilgrim steps to Italy, and if here he failed also, if indeed the being he sought was not to be found, if fancy had cheated him with a dread of what would not be if his desire was to be unsatisfied, his resolve was to return from the wildering world of imagination to the real world of action, to let ambition have a proper sway within his heart, to aspire to a station among the magnates of the land, to live for others as hitherto he had lived but for himself. He knew that a man may himself be bankrupt in happiness, and yet bestow it. So he came to Rome, where for a time the distracting thoughts which so long had torn his bosom became subdued. He was now amid the wrecks of national glory and grandeur, and thinking on what Rome had been, and viewing her present littleness. It was no wonder, if spirit-led by the memory of hoar antiquity, he should forget his own thoughts. But this was soon past. He still trod upon the grave of empire, but the spell had lost its power. He returned to the contemplation of the shrined hopes of his youthful fancy. smiling at his having ever forgotten them. But at Rome, though his stay was prolonged, his pursuit of the embodiment of mental and personal beauty was in vain. Yet he lingered with the Niobe of nations. At length, when hope grew dead and he had become even somewhat ashamed of the fantasy which had cost him so much anxiety, he was preparing, in a chastened and sober mood, to return to England, when he was persuaded to attend a masked ball at the Palace Borghese. He mingled with the crowds and was quitting that gorgeous scene where happy hearts were more happy and sad ones put on the seeming of joy to cheat themselves into a forgetfulness of grief, when a lady, habited as Hebe, attracted his attention. He spoke to her, and her ready wit, eloquent words, rich simplicity of manner, and rare dignity of demeanour made him yet more interested in this chance companion. It was the sole daughter of the last of the haughty house of Colonna who thus enslaved him. She had marked the coldness of his manner, the abstraction of his very mirth, and with all the innocent thoughtlessness of suspicionless youth, had sportively said that she would endeavour to thaw the frozen veil which enwrapped the northern stranger. She succeeded. I mentioned that Julian, for I will name him thus, was of high birth. The ancestral house of Colonna, on whose columns the honours of Rome once rested, remained prouder in its poverty than even when wealth gave it a golden appearance. Julian soon knew that a daughter of that high and haughty line would not be given to a stranger. The Colonna family numbered the mighty among its alliances of old, and Leonora, this fair and sole scion of its latter days, was destined for a convent's cell, or a marriage of interest. And the knowledge of this but fed the flame which filled Julian's heart. He loved this fair daughter of the land of beauty and of passion. To him she appeared the realization of all which he had hopelessly hoped for, the gem worth a monarch's ransom, to be snatched from the treasury of life, and pressed to his heart as priceless. He offered his hand and heart to the lovely maiden. The offer met with calm and cold rejection, but it is said, I cannot guess how truly, that in Italy, as in England, a lady's no may sometimes be interpreted by love into a half compliance, and Julian found it well to hold this consoling casuistry of passion. It were a tedious and perhaps an idle task to give, with the minuteness of an eyewitness, the delineations of passion, thoughts of whose workings I have not witnessed. Leonora was conscious of the power of her great beauty, proud too of her natural genius, and her wealth of accomplishments. But amid the consciousness of dominion and this pride of mind, there ran an undercurrent of deeper and better thoughts. She could know the value of a true heart. She soon repented the fancied necessity which led her to reject the hand of such a lover as Julian. To him, intellectual and enthusiastic, Leonor appeared as gifted in mind as she was confessedly peerless in person, and he still cherished, almost against hope, the thought that she might yet be the living flower to bloom by his ancestral hearth, soul in his heart and nurtured by his love. Mock not at such a hope. Love is most dreamlike. It is composed of an alternation of hopes and fears. Its hopes are clouded by the shadow fear flings across them, and its very fears are sun-tinted by the gleams which hope reflects from its mirror, whereon are imaged 1,000 thoughts of future bliss. And who may expect the boon of success so well as the young and the gifted? Julian was one of these. One evening in the autumn he walked amid the ruins of the Colosseum, accompanied by Leonor, for they had separated from the company. They paused to gaze upon the splendor of the Night Queen, then springing from her glory bed on high, illumining the world with her silvery sheen. It was a scene for the heart to muse over, with a melancholy not unpleasing, beholding the shattered remains of the world's ancient mistress. It was a scene for regret, for memory, for admiration, but it did not deeply interest them long, for when the heart beats high with the pulse of passion, love becomes the only inspiration of the thoughts of youth. Leonor felt the dangerous stillness of that hour and scene. The devotedness of her lover had touched her heart. Is it not ever thus? And as she looked stealthily upon his noble brow and drank in the eloquence which flowed from his lips, as he talked of the glory of Rome's elder days, and as his eye, even more eloquent than his winged words, beamed with enthusiasm as he spoke of that departed greatness, oh, who can blame if the haughty heart of the fair Colonna unbent from its pride, if a consciousness of her admirer's worth flashed across her with the suddenness of thought and the certainty of conviction, if a softer accent dwelt upon her tone and a tender feeling glanced from her flashing eye. She knew that this was the last evening of Julian's stay in Rome. At the rejection of his suit, he felt indignation, and there flows a narrow Rubicon to separate that feeling from love. To forget, however, is a task more difficult than to adore. With Julian, for he had tried it, forgetfulness was impossible. He had found it difficult to avoid her society. Latterly, his manner toward Leonor had been studiedly indifferent. But now, when the morrow's sun was to see him depart forever from the place which her presence had sanctified to him, from the only one who had ever seemed suited to share with him the difficult empire of his heart, there was a tenderness, unknown to himself, in his slightest words, and this stole into his heart, hitherto cold as the marble pillar at whose base they sat, which he had ceased to hope would ever respond to his. He changed the subject of their conversation. Hitherto he had spoken of indifferent themes, to while away the fast-thronging thoughts, unsummoned memories, which rose into his heart. The effort had failed. He ceased to speak, and Leonor and he were both silent, with mutual but unacknowledged emotions. At length he broke the silence. At first he spoke calmly, but as he proceeded, his voice had a deeper tone of feeling, his manner became more earnest, his eye flashed, and his cheek and brow grew passion-flushed. "We part, Leonor," said he. "I could have wished for a happier doom. Henceforth a solitary hearth and shattered hopes are mine. That I loved, that I love you, I need not now repeat. The tale had been told you once too often, but the feeling will not, cannot cease. But with my life, you with the pride of a high ancestral name, amid the admiration of 1,000 hearts and the hopes of youth and beauty, may live lovely and beloved, but the more bitter doom is mine." "No," interrupted Leonor. "Like yours, my course will be a lone and sorrowing one. I can bring but a worldly heart and baffled hopes to the altar, at which, as a victim, I am to be devoted. A little month will see my youth and its beauty, which you praise, lost in the gloom of a convent cell. Perhaps before then you will have forgotten this passion which you say consumes you." But as she spoke the words, there was a melancholy tenderness to her subdued voice, and Julian's hopes began to bud anew. Even when we are turning away from the portal of hope, some recalling whisper is heard to teach us the open sesame which we had forgotten. "And why, dearest Leonor, need a convent's gloom be the portion of one so fair, so hearted? Are there no climes but this of Italy where love can make the fond heart happy? No skies where tenderness may not bloom, and exhaustless affection be nourished? In my own land there are happy hearts to greet my return, and love her whose love would make glad my home. Fly with me then, if flight be needful, or here give me a claim to call you my own. Let a husband's rights supersede those of a parent, and the utmost pride of Rome's haughtiest houses shall not and cannot break the love links by which our happy hearts will be united." The lady's answer is not on record, but she placed her hand in his and threw herself into his arms and wept, long but not bitterly. If these be not symptoms of her accordance to his proffer, then am I unversed in the lore of love. The mingled whispers of the lovers, the glad confession, each to each, of the birth and progress of their affection, the happy aspirations for a long life-dream of joy that hope breathed forth, these cannot be mistaken. Has love a happier time than this? Ere they parted, the lovers had agreed to substitute the nuptial ceremony for that ritual sacrifice by which it was intended to dedicate Leonor to cold celibacy. Her heart had always abhorred the cell. She felt happy at avoiding it, and thus there is always some bitterness springing up to cast its poison into the cup of life. The young can but dream of these things at first, but the more mature feel them in sad reality. Some busy babbler, some wretched eavesdropper, had listened to the converse of the lovers, and by the morrow's dawn her proud father had learned the affection and the resolve of Leonor. He had no compunction when he doomed her to the gloom of a convent, that living grave where woman in her youth and beauty is entombed, with all her budding affections and delicate hopes. But his heart panted with indignation when he knew that his daughter had dared to feel for herself and wed happiness. "I would not," said he, "have had her espouse the proudest he in Rome, and she shall not wed with a stranger to her country and its faith." So, ere a week passed, Leonor had been forced to commence her novitiate in the convent. Distraction seized on Julian when he learned this. He had been absent at Venice when this harsh step was taken, and exaggeration reported that Leonor had been professed a nun. His paroxysms of anger and outraged love eventuated in a dangerous and tedious illness, which subsided into the melancholy madness in which I first saw him. He was placed in that lazar house on the lone island in the Venetian lagoon, of which I have already made mention. Leonor inherited all the lofty spirit of her ancestors. She did not lack the heart to conceive, nor the will to execute. Weeks passed, and consciousness of her wrongs, with the excitement of her love, stronger from its persecution as religion grows mightier from the bonds and bars in which intolerance would bind it, urged the desire of rescue, of return to liberty and love. After a time, the circumstances of Julian's madness reached her ear and augmented her determined will. He, thought she, cannot now take me from this living tomb. What he cannot achieve for me, let me perform for him. Let me break the bonds which detain me here, and hasten to restore his mind to its wonted vigor. Medicine fails to do so, but there is a spell in the great power of love which can administer hope even to the hopeless, drive despair from the despairing, and relume the flickering lamp of reason with a light as beautiful as affection ever gleamed upon pain. At the festival of the Carnival, immediately preceding Lent, there is always allowed great latitude and liberty to both sexes. Sometimes, although it does not commonly occur, the novices are permitted to leave their convents under strict surveillance, and in quaint disguises of the season, mingle with that world of life and love to which they are on the eve of bidding a long farewell. To Leonor this indulgence was proffered and by her accepted. Her demeanor had been so calm, her devotion so regular, her endurance so voiceless, that they feared the monotony of such a life might wear away the vigor of her mind, even as water, drop by drop, wears away the marble, and they did not apprehend that such apathy as hers would abuse the privilege they allowed her. So she mingled with the crowd, and her well-assumed air of abstraction completely deceived her attendant, until at length she became less watchful, and in this interregnum of vigilance Leonor was left to herself. She seized the opportunity afforded by this desertion, and speeded to execute her project. Its boldness was equalled by its success. At that time the 7th Pius wore the pontifical tiara. Leonor was no stranger to the person of the good old man. She had more than once received his almost paternal blessing, and to the Vatican she now proceeded, strong in hope. There was not much dignity preserved in that stately dwelling of the head of the Church on earth, and in that season of revelry and feasting that little was so much relaxed that it was no very difficult matter for Leonor to penetrate, almost unquestioned, into the private chamber of the pontiff. She had passed through the splendid suite of apartments, and at length reached the peculiar and private audience room of the Pope. As she paused by the door, pondering on the best mode of interesting Pius in the story of her wrongs, she was accosted in a gentle and parental tone by an old man plainly clothed and bearing no external marks of pomp or power. But in his dark eye, which the storms of 70 years had scarcely dimmed, and on his lofty brow was enthroned that dignity which high station and its consciousness rarely fail to confer. It was the Pope. She threw herself at his feet in an agony of tears. Her heart had failed her when the goal of her desires was reached. The compassionate and mild old man raised her from the ground and courteously led her into the chamber. In a very few moments she was calm. The magnitude of the stake, hope and happiness, gave her self-possession and courage. She told her story. She implored the interference of the Holy Father, and in the pathos of her tale won unaccustomed tears from his aged eye. Is there not a charm in the narrative of true and trusting love? Is there not a spell in the holiness of truth and the fervour of affection? There must be so, for the pontiff wept over the sorrows of this youthful lady, and whispered consolation and hope to her wounded spirit. "I release you, my daughter," said he, "from the solitude of the conventual life. The vows which are not sanctified by a willing spirit cannot be worthy heaven. Earth as yet has higher claims upon you. Go and join him to whom your heart's hopes are wedded. Offer with him those conjugal vows which are a holy rite of his faith and a solemn sacrament of ours. Go, serve your God in another land, for your stay cannot be safe in this. And if ever your heart should incline to stray from that faith, which has been the faith of your fathers through long ages, remember that I have blessed your union with one whose God is my God, although we worship him in different modes, and pray to the throne of the highest for grace to guide you in the true path to peace here and happiness hereafter." Fervently did Leonor thank him, and rapidly did she run through the plan which she had formed for the restoration of her Julian to health and happiness. The good old man smiled at her eagerness of anticipation, and approved of the details of her project. He even offered her money to assist it, and she accepted the assistance. She took leave of him, deeply touched by his kindness, and pleased with the success of her romantic mission. She did not return to the convent. When Julian had resided for some time in the Venetian madhouse, his disease became much mitigated. It subsided into melancholy. In a word, he was quite rational upon all points but one. He believed that Leonor was lost to him forever, and thus he had no console him. The very sound of a woman's voice pained him. This was the fatal chord which could not be touched without awakening the violence of his most darkened mood. When first I saw him, I was struck with the elegance of his pursuits, even in that melancholy abode. One day, as I was passing by his door, he accompanied himself on the guitar. His voice was sweet in its manly depth, and he displayed no inconsiderable skill in music. His song was simple, the words were his own, and he had arranged them to a wild but pathetic melody. The song ran thus: "As the violet loveth the welcome shade, and the mariner loveth the sea, as a peasant boy loveth his native glade, where his bounding step is free, as a nightingale loveth the lonely flower, which blooms by the rippling rill, As the maiden loveth the moonlight hour where music hails her still, so doth my spirit cling to thine, and it never would part more, and fancy all it loved were mine. Leonor, Leonor, Leonor. But the mariner finds an ocean grave, and the violet blooms to die, and the peasant sinks into the slave beneath some tyrant's eye, and withers the rose by the rippling stream, and the bird's sweet strain grows dull, and a cloud flits over the moon's pale beam for the loss of the beautiful. And thus, fair spirit, thoughts of thee in care and grief are o'er. Why lingers the bright, the glad, the free? Leonor, Leonor, Leonor. While he was singing, my steps had been arrested by the melody, so unusual in such a place, and I yet remained by the door of his apartment when he opened it. A few words of apology led to a gentle and gracious reply from him. A few moments after, and we were wandering arm in arm in the garden of the citadel. I did not know then that he was confined therein. Indeed, I was scarcely aware of the use to which the Austrian authorities at Venice had devoted that building. We separated with a promise to meet again. On inquiry, my boatman told me the popular legend of Julian's sad story, and you may be sure it did not mar the interest I took in him. Frequently I visited that lone island, and became more and more pleased with the wonders of mind and the treasures of knowledge, which were the rich possessions of the ill-fated Julian. At last, scarcely a day passed that I did not visit him, for the gaiety of Venice, all glare and glitter, did not suit my mind at the time. My friends smiled as I withdrew from their mirthful society, and many rare quips and jests were passed upon my relinquishing their converse for that of my unhappy countrymen. That I did so was well known in Venice. One day, just as I was about leaving my home for Julian's habitation, a boy was ushered into the chamber on the plea of urgent business. In a sweet voice and with entreating aspect he said, "Dismiss the attendants." I did so, and he threw himself before me, soliciting my permission to attend on my friend Julian. "As a companion, an attendant, a menial, I know," said he, "that I have the power of restoring him to health, and I trust you will not refuse the boon I pray for." I raised the youth from his lowly posture. We had a long interview, during which he communicated such peculiar circumstances that I could no longer refuse to comply with his request, and with a hope-flushed cheek and a heart swelling with admiration of the conduct of the youth, who had given me full confidence in his history and intentions, I went to the island. I did not lose much time in mentioning to Julian that I had brought a careful attendant with me. Briefly explaining that the youth had solicited to wait upon him, I introduced him. I perceived Julian's cheek to flush and his eyes to brighten and his frame to tremble with emotion when the youth entered. These were momentary, but renewed more slightly when he heard the youth's voice, which was low and sweet. As he waited upon us at table, I noticed that his lip quivered and his cheek paled as he watched the ravages which disease and neglect had made in the features of Julian. Matters went on smoothly enough for some weeks, until the youth one day called me aside and said, "I am tired of this horror of suspense, and would wish to undertake Julian's cure now, before the heat of the summer season, which is always dangerous in this climate to those who suffer from disease of the mind." So, knowing what he purposed doing, I acquiesced. That night when we sat at supper, the youth brought a crystal goblet full of wine, which he proffered to Julian. "It is," said he, "your birthday, and you must make merry with your friend as they do in England, my dear master." Julian said with a smile, "I will drink if you will tell me how you know what I had forgotten, that this is my birthday." The youth blushed and replied, "Drink of the wine first, and I will afterward inform you." So Julian drained the cup, and suddenly fell back on the sofa, for the youth had mixed with the wine a subtle powder, which had the power of inducing strong and sudden sleep. We placed him on the couch at ease and waited his awakening. He slept calmly as an infant for many hours, and when at last the heaviness of slumber appeared abating, and we could perceive by his restless movements, the youth left the room, saying, "If he complains of thirst, give him to drink of the cup which stands in yon recess, and before then do not doubt to lead the conversation on the subject of his illness and its cause." Presently Julian awoke, and I knew by the colour on his cheek and the calmness of his glance that a great change had taken place. He first, as if to himself, murmured the refrain of his song, "Leonor, Leonor, Leonor," and then, after a pause, said, "I am, as it were, awakening from a dream. Will you not inform me of what has happened?" And I told him of his illness, and we spoke of the cause, and then I knew that he was recovered, for he did not decline to hear me speak of Leonor, whose name heretofore he had allowed none but himself to speak. "We must save her," said he. "She loves me better than she loves aught else in this world. The youth who hath so carefully attended me, and yourself, shall join to save her." Then he inquired where that youth was, and complained of a great thirst. I remembered what instructions the youth had given, and handed the cup of wine to him. He drank. At the bottom of the cup was a golden ring, which, when he saw, he trembled, and his cheeks grew pale as death, and he was for a time without motion, except the tremulous quiver of his lips, which were much convulsed. "Whence came this?" said he at last, and as I was about replying, the door opened, and the youth entered, not dressed in the attire of manhood, as hitherto, but habited as a lady, bright and beautiful, and Julian, when he saw her, knew his lost Leonor. Indeed, I knew from the first who she was, for she had told me, but fearing that her sudden appearance might altogether overthrow his mind, she had thus provided to obtain a crisis by means of the subtle drug which she put into his wine. It was a fearful experiment, but what will not love essay when health and happiness are trembling in the scale against madness and despair? You may be certain that we kept silence on these matters. I took upon myself to procure a ship to convey the happy lovers to England. That night we quitted the island and proceeded to Malta, where Julian and Leonor were wedded. While we remained at Malta, news arrived of the death of the Pope, and much we deplored the loss of that true friend, who had not only sanctioned Leonor's escape, but checked pursuit after her, suggesting that it was probable she had drowned herself in despair at her baffled love. It is not necessary to continue the tale. The lovers went to England, where Julian's family, delighted at his recovery and return, were grateful to the fair cause of both. If, in youth, Julian was an idealist in fancy, he is now a realist in enjoyment. He has lived a happy man, and such happiness as his extends instead of diminishing. End of section 3.
Section number 4 of the Rover, Volume 1, number 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by April 6090. The Rover, Volume 1, number 7. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 4. The Ghost of Kilsheelan. It's something more nor 40, or 45 years ago, that there lived in Kilsheelan, in this very county of Tipperary, a real old gentleman. He was one Major Blennerhassett, one of the real old Protestants, none o' you upstarts that come in with Cromwell or Ludlow, or any o' the blackguard Biblemen o' them days. For the only difference of a Bibleman now, and the Biblemans o' former times, was just this, that Cromwell's Bibleman used to burn us out of house and home, while the Bibleman now only tells us that we are going to blaze. So, your honor, you see they were determined to fire us one way or another. Well, as I was telling you, Major Blennerhassett was a real old Protestant, and though he'd curse and swear and damn the Papists when he'd be in a passion, the devil a one of him would be ever after turning us out of our little buildings. Supposin' we were 2 or 3 or maybe 5 gales in arrear. Now you may be sure that all the boys were distracted one morning to hear that the Major was found with his throat cut from ear to ear, in a most unhandsome manner. There wasn't a Papist in the parish but knew that he hadn't a hand in it, for the Major was as dead as a door-nail, or Queen Elizabeth. There wasn't a neighbor's child in the entire barony that wasn't up at the Major's big house in no time, to hear how the poor master's throat was cut, and when they saw him it was plain to be seen that the Major didn't do it himself, for there was the poor right hand cut in 2 nearly, and such a gash as he had in his throat, they all said couldn't be given by himself, because the Major, it was well known, wasn't Kilsheelan left-handed. Besides that, there was the old gold watch gone, and his bonds, and what money he had in the house, along with the £500 note. To be sure, the magistrates had an inquest, and pretty work they made about it, and maybe the newspapers didn't make fine talk about it. They never stopped for 3 months sayin' all the Protestants in Tipperary were murdered by the Papists, and so on, till this peaceable county was under the Insurrection Act. And then, to be sure, they never stopped transportin' us, and all this was by raison of a decent gentleman's throat being cut by some blackguard or another. At all events, there was no making head nor tail o' the Major's murder till comin' on the assizes, when 2 innocents, one Jack Carey and one Bill Dorney, was taken up for it. My father knew the 2 chaps well, and except that they didn't care what they did to come round a girl, he often told me that milder, nor innocenter, nor modester, nor partier behaved boys he never seen. The people, in fact, were sure they would be acquitted till they heard that Lord Newberry was comin' the circuit, and then they gave it up as a bad job. At last the day o' the trial came, and to the surprise and wonderment of everybody, who should get upon the table and take the book in his hand, to swear away the lives of poor Jack Carey and Bill Dorney, but one Kit Cooney. Now Kit, you must know, was the only creature that lived with the Major, for the Major was an old bachelor, and Cooney fled the country after the Major was murdered, and, in troth, every one thought it was he who did the Major's business, for he wasn't the best o' character at any time, and every one was wonderin' why the Major let him live with him at all. Up Kit got on the table, and bold as a lion, he swore hard and fast as a trooper that Dorney and Carey murdered the Major in his bed, and that he himself, Kit Cooney, the vagabond, agreed to join them in doing so, but that he repented of it, and wouldn't lay a hand on the old man, but ran away to Dublin when it was all over, and told the police there all about it. He was, you see, sir, a king's evidence, an informer, and, in short, he hung the 2 men. The truth was, Cooney had the Dublin police magistrates to back him out, and the 2 poor boys wouldn't prove an alibi at all. But this indeed I often heard their friends say, that if the 2 gossoons liked it, they could have proved alibis for them in 20 different places, all at the same time, and each of them 40 miles away from the murder. Besides that, the 2 boys themselves could show as clear as daylight where they really were the night the Major was murdered. The fact was, it was said that Carey and Dorney were doing something that night they didn't want the priest to know anything about. At all events, they might have let such evidence alone, for they'd have been hung on Kit Cooney's affidavit at any rate. They, to be sure, said they were innocent, and the people believed them. The judge said they were guilty, and the jury believed him. and the 2 young men were hung accordingly. This, sir, I was telling you, happened 45 years ago, and just like the present times, Cooney knew the country too well to stop in it. At best, he was but an informer, and Tipperary is a spot that was always counted too hot for them kind of rapscallions. It wasn't for many years after that he was heard of, and that way that mention was made of him was just thus. It was, you see, about 26 years next Holy Eve night that my Aunt Biddy, and it's from her own son I have the story, which is next to knowing it myself. It was on that very night, and it's a night that's mighty remarkable entirely for quare stories of the good people, that she was standing at the door of poor old Major Blennerhouse's house, that was, and looking out to see what in the world was keeping Patty, that was her husband's name, so long at the market of Golden, for it was market day in Golden, when she seen a well-dressed farmer-like man with clothes on him that looked as if they were made in Dublin. You see, they hadn't the Tipperary cut upon them at all. And there was this decentish old man standing right opposite her on the road, and looking terrible narrow at the house. Well, she thought nothing at all o' that, for it's few people could pass the road without stopping to look at the Major's house. It was such an out-of-the-way big one to be so near the high road. "God save you, ma'am," says he. "God save you kindly, sir," says she. "It's a cold night," says he. "'Tis," says she. "Will you come in and take an air o' the fire?" "I will," says he. So she brought him down to the kitchen, and the first thing she remarked was that she forgot to tell him of an ugly step that lay in his way, and that everybody tripped over, if they weren't told of it, or didn't know it well before. And yet without a trip or a jostle, but smooth and smack, clean like herself, the stranger walked downstairs before her. "By now, Sawkins," said she to herself, "you were here before, my good man, whoever you are, and I must keep my eyes upon you." And then she talks out to him. "Are you dry or hungry?" says she. "No, but I'd like a drink o' buttermilk," says he. "Why, then, I'll get the same for you," says she. "What countryman are you?" "Then, to tell you the truth," says he, "I'm a Connie man." "Why, then, you haven't a bit of the brogue," says she, "but talk English almost entirely as well as myself." "Oh," says he, "I was in Dublin polishing off the brogue." "That accounts," says she, "for the fine accent you have. Were you ever in these parts before?" "Never," says he. "That's a lie," says she to herself, "but I'll go and fetch you a noggin o' the buttermilk." "Thank'ee," says he. You see, she left him sittin' in the kitchen, and while she went for the buttermilk, which was to a pantry like off the kitchen, and while she was there, she saw the stranger put his hand to the second brick in the hob, take out some little parcel, and run it into his breeches pocket. While he was doing this, she saw his little black ferret eyes, that were not longer in appearance nor a hawk's, but were bright and glistening and dazzling like them, wheeling all round the kitchen to see if anyone was watching him. In a minute she knew the gallows look of him. It was Kit Cooney that had hung her own flesh and blood, till they were high and dry as a side o' bacon. To be sure, the poor woman was frightened enough, but she was very stout and didn't let on, and accordingly she came out with the noggin, and when he drank it off she sat down opposite him and asked him would he stop the night, as her husband would be home in a few minutes, and would be glad to see only one that could tell him about the castle, and the Parliament House, and the bridges, and the Lord Mayor, and all the fine sights of Dublin. "No, thank'ee," says he. "I must be in Golden to-night. I've got all I wanted from you." "Faith you have," says she to herself again, "but whatever it is, it's more nor a drink o' buttermilk." Well, sir, the man left her, and she sat down waiting for her husband, quite melancholy like, and wondering what in the world it was that Cooney had taken from behind the hob. She searched it mighty cutely, but if she was looking from that day to this, not a ha'porth she could find, but an empty hole, and nothing in it. 10 o'clock struck, 11 o'clock, and no Patty was yet come home. So to comfort herself she sat down to make a cup of tea, and to make it strong, she determined to put a stick, a glass of whiskey, in it. She had the bread and the butter, and the whiskey bottle, and the tea-pot laid comfortably on the settle bed, and there she was, sittin' on a creepin' little stool besides it. When the clock struck 12, the very instant it did, she heard the drawing-room door open, and tramp, 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 she heard 2 feet coming downstairs, and whack, 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 went a stick against the banisters, as if somebody who was lame was hobbling down to her, as well as his 2 legs on a stick would carry him. To be sure, this woman was frightened enough. She knew it could not be Paddy, for if he had a stick in his fist, he would be more likely to knock it against a man's head than an old wooden banister. "The Lord save us!" says she to herself. "Is this Kit Cooney's coming back to massacre me? Lo!" she then called out, "you vagabond! Whoever you are, don't be afraid to show face to an honester woman than ever your mother was." Devil an answer she got. "Oh," says she, "maybe it's nobody at all. I'll take another cup of tea at any rate." She had just filled it out and put the second stick in it, and was mixing it with the spoon, when she turned up her eyes, and who in the world should she see leaning over the settle-bed and looking quite cantankerous and doleful at the same time at her, but the Major himself. There was in the very same dress that she had seen on him the very last day he was out with the temporary militia. He had on a cocked hat that was at least 3 feet broad, and 2 gold bands on it that were glistening as grandly as if they had only that minute come out o' the shop and had never got a drop o' rain on them. Then he had a large black leather stock on his neck, and a grand red officer's coat, that between the green that it was turned up with, and the gold that was shining all over it, you could hardly tell what color it was. His shirt was as fine as silk, and fringed with beautiful tuckers, and then the leather breeches on his thin old legs were as white as the driven snow, and his boots that came up to his knees were as black and polished as a craw's neck. The Major, in fact, was dressed out in the very shoot that he went up to Dublin to get for himself, and that he never wore, barring it was on the King's birthday or the like. To be sure, poor Biddy, who knew that the Major was buried many a long day ago, and knowing too right well, she got drunk with grief at his wake, was spifflicated, and in fact, sir, completely nonplussed with admiration when she saw him standing before her in his best clothes. She hadn't time to say, "God save you kindly," to him when he said to her, "So, Biddy, a man can't walk down his own stairs that was, without your abusing like a pickpocket and calling him names. I little thought I'd ever hear your mother's daughter call poor old Major Blennerhassett that yer was a friend to you and yours, a vagabond. It's easy knowing it's in my grave I am, and not here, or you'd cut the tongue out o' your ugly head before you'd dare to say such a word to me, you drunken blackguard." "Oh, then, Major," says Biddy, "sure enough, if I knew that it was you that was in it, I'd be the biggest o' vagabonds to call you names. But how the world was I to think that you'd be walking like a white boy at this unseasonable hour o' the night? Oh, then, Biddy, if you knew how glad I am to get a walk, you wouldn't wonder at my walking whenever I'd be let. Maybe you'd be glad to stretch your limbs yourself, if they were afther being cramped 25 years in a cold grave. But how is Paddy?" "He is mighty well, thank ye, Major." "How many children have you betwixt you?" "Only 10, Major." "What's become of them?" "Why, then, it's mighty good o' you to ask after them, Major. Then, to tell you the truth, my 4 girls are married, and have 3 childer each. 2 of my boys were hanged in the Rising in '98. 3 more were transported, because their brothers were hung for that same. And my youngest son is in hospital from an accident he met with at the last fair o' Golden, when one of the Kinneleys broke his leg with a blow or a stone, because he was fighting as well as his shall I would let him for the Hogans, who you know yourself our cousin German's or his own. But, Major, I'm sorry to see you look so delicate. Is there anything the matter with you?" "Anything the matter with me? Why then, Biddy, you're enough to drive a man mad. It's no wonder Patty often gives you a mully-rugan beating. And thing the matter with me? Blur an ounty fish. Am not I dead and buried? What worse could be the matter with a man nor that? Besides, I'm cruel dry. My mouth is filled with the sawdust that was put in my coffin, and I did not taste a drop of wine, malt, or spirits with this many a long day." "Why then, Major," said she, "maybe you'd take a cup o' tea with me. I've some green in the house." "Oh, hold your tongue, Biddy, or you'll drive me ragin' mad entirely, and then I might disremember what brought me here. You couldn't take much tea yourself, ma'am, if you met with such an accident as that in your gullet. Look at me," says the Major, taking off his leather stock. "Am not I just like an old turkey cock on a Friday, that you were going to dress for my dinner on a Sunday? Wouldn't this be a purty throat to go to a tea party with?" And as he said this, the Major loosed his stock, and there, sure enough, upon the side of that, Biddy didn't wonder that he held his head steady with one of his hands, for fear it might fall off of his shoulders entirely. "Oh, Major," says she, "it's plain to see that they were taking the head off you. Bad luck to their hands that did the same for you." "Amen," says the Major, "and high hanging on a windy day to them too. But the dirty rascal, you see, Biddy, that did that is still walking the face of the earth. He hung your innocent nephews for it too. But I won't have my walk for nothing, Biddy. If you remember what I'm going to say to you, do you know who was here tonight? It was Kit Cooney. Now mind my words, you seen him taking something out o' the hob tonight. That was a purse o' mine, as full o' guineas as the Chatelar church is full o' saints. And it was Cooney that put it there, after killing me, and my blood is on the purse still, and you recollect he swore on my trial that he got none o' my money. Now the lying scoundrel, at this very minute he has my gold watch in his fob, with my own name on it, and that 500 pound note, that my cousin was more sorry for the loss of than he was o' himself. That is this very minute in the inside o' my gold watch, and my name's on it. The villain was afraid by reason o' that to change the note ever since. Let you and Patty follow him now to Golden. You will find him in a Shrewsbury house there. Charge him with this murder, and tell him what I say to him, and let him take my word for it, that I'll never stop walking till I see him walk to the gallows. And Biddy, now that you mayn't be thinking this a drame, you have. Here's a guinea that I saved out of the fire, and I'll make you a present of it." "Thank ye, Major," says she. "You were always good to me." So she held out her hand to him for the gold guinea he was going to give to her. Her heart leaped up to her mouth when she saw it, for it was as shining and as yellow as a buttercup in a green field on a May morning. "There, it's for you," says he. "Hold it fast, and don't forget I was with you." With that she shut her hand on the guinea, and the minute she closed her fingers on it, she thought the hand was burnt off her. "Oh, Major, Major," says she, "you've murdered me entirely." "Ah, what Major are you talking of?" called out Patty, who was that moment come home, and found Biddy jumping and skipping round the kitchen like a mad dog or a young kitten. "What, Major?" answered Biddy. "Why, the old Major that was here this minute." "It's drunk you are, or dramin'," said Patty. "Why then, if I am," said Biddy, "look in the tea-cup, and you'll find the Major's guinea that I threw there to cool it off. By the powers, it has burnt the finger and thumb off me." With that Patty went to the cup, and instead of a guinea he found nothing but a smoking cinder. If Biddy took her oath of it, nothing would persuade Patty but that she was draymin', till she told him o' Kit Cooney bein' there, and all the Major said to her. Well, the upshot of it was that Patty and Biddy went to the priest and told him all that happened, and the priest went to a magistrate, Mr. Fitzgibbon, that he knew had a spite to the father of the magistrate that took Cooney's swearin' against Carrie and Dorney. Cooney was arrested by Mr. Fitzgibbon, and the purse, and the watch, and the £500 note were found exactly as the ghost told Biddy, and Mr. Fitzgibbon and the priest never let Cooney alone till he owned to the murder, and that the two poor boys, who by this time should be the father of 14 or 15 children apiece, were completely innocent. Cooney was accordingly hung at the next assizes, and there wasn't a Carey nor a Dorney in Tipperary that wasn't at the hanging in Clonmel. As to that, we have revenged ourselves well on them Cooneys, for at the last fair o' Thurles the Careys gave 3 Cooneys such a thrashing that it will be a mighty square thing entirely if one of the 3 live to see next Christmas Day. Take my word for it, that the worst kind of cattle in Ireland are the informers. End of section number 4.
Section 5 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 7, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 5, Victor, or the Fisherman's Foundling, by A. Oakley. At a romantic village in the north, some years past, there resided in a small but neat cottage an humble aged fisherman, bearing the name of Arnold. He had been reduced to extreme privations by becoming security for a friend, but still he had a treasure which to his imagination far exceeded any other. This was an only daughter, a lovely girl, whose transcendent beauty was the admiration of all who gazed upon her, and in whom was concentrated every virtue that heaven could bestow. She mourned in secret her father's poverty, but in his presence she endeavored by her affection and attention to smooth the rugged path of his life, and lead him to pleasure and contentment. It was the natal day of Ellen, who had attained her 18th year. She was seated by her father's side, her raven ringlets hanging on her snowy bosom, and the smile of innocence playing on her lovely countenance. She contrasted finely with the care-worn features and the silvery hair of Arnold, her father, who, though evidently laboring under heavy affliction, endeavored to force a smile, and inwardly blessed his only offspring. They had nearly finished their morning meal, when Ellen began the conversation in the following words: "Tell me, father, when do you expect our dear Edward will return from sea?" "Ellen, my child," answered her father, "if I anticipate rightly, in 2 months we shall again behold him." "Indeed," said Ellen, "but how strange it is, dear father, that you have never discovered any of his friends." "Ay," returned Arnold, "strange indeed, girl. 'Tis now 16 years ago, when one morning, while hastening to the seaside for the purpose of fishing, I beheld a lovely boy, apparently lifeless, stretched upon the beach. I flew to his aid, and with joy discovered that it still breathed. I instantly conveyed the little sufferer hither, and consigned it to the care of your poor mother, bless her memory. She relieved its wants and cherished it as though it was her own offspring. From that time, Edward, for so I have called him, became your playmate and companion. I made every inquiry in my power to ascertain his parents, but was never able to succeed. 2 years since, as you well remember, he expressed a desire to become a sailor. I obtained for him a situation in a vessel and placed in his charge the locket found round his infant waist, thinking it might prove a clue to the discovery of his long-lost parents, and then reluctantly for a short time consented to part with him. The pearly drops chased each other down Ellen's cheek, as in mournful accents she said, "Oh, father, I shall never forget the day he left us. I never wept so much in my life, but he promised soon to come back to us." "Alas," said her father, "I fear I shall not have a roof to shelter him when he returns, for I have not money to pay our heartless landlord, and he threatens to turn us out of the cottage. They will convey me to prison," continued he, in an agitated voice, "and you, my child, my only joy, will become a houseless wanderer. Oh, heavens, I scarce can—" Tears choked his utterance, and he fell exhausted into his chair. Ellen gazed upon his aged form, breathed a prayer to heaven for his protection, and wiped away the tears that rolled down his furrowed cheeks. At length he recovered, and they tenderly embraced each other. At this moment a knock was heard at the cottage door, and on Ellen opening it, she was presented with a letter. She gave it to her father, who desired her to read it to him. She immediately broke the seal and read the following lines: "It is with feelings of the deepest regret I write to inform you that, as the vessel in which Edward was my shipmate was returning home about 6 months since, it was wrecked." "Oh, heavens!" cried Ellen. "Read, father, read." Arnold took the letter with trembling hands, which proceeded thus: "And Edward, with all the crew except myself, met a watery grave." On hearing the last sentence, Ellen shrieked and hysterically exclaimed, "He is dead! He is gone! Ah, ha, ha!" Overcome by her feelings, she fell into the arms of her father. Every preparation had been made at the castle for a grand entertainment, which was to be given by the owner, Count Alfonso. This man was about 40 years of age, of sullen aspect and fierce disposition. He advanced alone from the castle with an agitated step. His very frame seemed convulsed with fear, and conscience was gnawing at his heart. At length he muttered to himself, "Alfonso, when will thy miseries cease? My murdered victims haunt my mind, my footsteps, my couch, my every action. The dagger with which I struck the fatal blow seem glittering before me. And see, see," he exclaimed in a fit of frenzy, "see the blood! The hot blood is streaming from its point. Oh, agony insupportable!" At this instant a ruffian in his pay, covered with a dark cloak, came toward him, and having satisfied himself that no one observed him, in a hoarse voice intimated that his hand and dagger were at his master's service. "Marvin," said Alfonso, "listen to me. Ellen, the daughter of Arnold, the poor fisherman, must become mine. He is indebted to me for rent, which I know he cannot discharge. Could I obtain her consent to unite herself to me by a false marriage, should I obtain my every desire, this, Marvin, for many reasons, would be better than violence. I have been rejected, but her lover has since died, and perhaps—" At this instant he saw the form of Ellen approaching them. They immediately concealed themselves from observation. Ellen, who was on her way home, paused as she drew near the castle. In the bitterness of her grief she exclaimed, "Oh, my father, what will be your fate? No one to assist thee in thy declining age. I had hoped that Edward— oh, let me not mention that much loved name, it rends my soul." The tears flowed down her lovely face as Alfonso now came toward her. "Ellen," said he, "why this sadness? What melancholy thoughts hang so heavy on that snowy brow?" "Oh, my lord," she replied, the tears starting from her beaming eyes, "my father!" "Ay, 'tis true," returned Alfonso. "He is poor and friendless. But consent to become mine, and you save him. I love you, and your life would be one of pleasure. Come." "Oh, my lord," cried Ellen, "do not urge me to this. Kneeling, I implore you to save my father from a prison. Do this, and a daughter's gratitude. Alfonso interrupted her. 'Tis your love I seek. I'm rich, and every blessing will attend thee and thy father. Ellen, let this kiss decide it. He attempted to kiss her, but she, disengaging herself from his grasp, rushed from him. Hence, my lord, she exclaimed, hence, nor dare insult me more. Take all that we possess. Leave us houseless, penniless, destitute of food, then glory in the manly triumph you will achieve. Still the humble fisherman and his offspring will retain one treasure that the oppressors of the poor, the destroyers of virtue, never, never can: a clear, unsullied conscience, and a heart that never felt a pang by the thought of having committed an action which would not be blessed with the approving smile of heaven. Ellen hurried from his presence, and was soon far from the castle. The Count stood for some moments silent, and at length in a passionate tone cried, "Fool that I was to suffer her to escape thus easily! But still she shall be mine. Marvin, instantly to Arnold's dwelling, and drag him, spite of all opposition, to a dungeon in the castle." "The best plan would be to silence him at once," cried Marvin, laying his hand upon his dagger. Alfonso started at these words. "No, no," he replied. "Blood enough has been shed already to gain for me these estates." "Ha, ha, ha!" cried the ruffian. "Why think of that? 'Tis so long since that I declare I had almost forgotten the whole transaction, although it was this very poniard that drank the blood of the much-loved Count Victor. But why think of that? Let us return to business. What's to be done with the girl?" "Let her also be brought hither. Away, Marvin, away!" Marvin instantly quitted his master's presence. With an air of triumph, Alfonso resumed: "Now, proud girl, thou shalt soon find that Alfonso, like unto the hungry vulture, never suffers his prey to escape him." He then followed Marvin on his way to Arnold's cottage. Ellen meanwhile proceeded toward her home. She entered the cottage, and found her father in the most poignant grief. "Oh, my father," said she, "how can this calamity be averted? They will take thee to a loathsome dungeon, the winter of thy days to be passed in gloomy wretchedness." "Nay, my child," replied he, soothingly, "I care not for myself, so that my Ellen is happy." "Happy!" repeated Ellen. "Oh, do not think thus of your child. Ever have you been the most affectionate of fathers. To increase my comfort has been your greatest pleasure. And now that poverty and wretchedness surrounds thee, can I dream of happiness? Oh, my father, talk not thus, or you will break your poor Ellen's heart." "Forgive me!" exclaimed Arnold. "My child, my poor Ellen!" They were folded in each other's arms, when a loud knocking was heard at the door. Ellen, excited at almost to madness, entreated her parent to cling to her, and in a voice choked with emotion cried, "They shall not part us." Marvin, finding the door was not speedily opened, raised the latch, and entering the apartment, exclaimed, "Arnold, I am ordered, unless you instantly pay the money owing to the Count, to convey you to prison." Ellen imploringly begged of him to desist. "Nay, my lady," said Marvin, "Count Alfonso will not release your father but upon one condition, that is, that you consent to his proposals." Arnold indignantly replied, "Never shall she purchase my liberty at the expense of her own happiness." "Well, then," returned Marvin, "you must go with me." He immediately seized the feeble fisherman, and dragged him toward the door. Ellen clung to her father, exclaiming, "Spare him! Spare my father!" At this crisis the Count entered the cottage, and, bowing, ordered Marvin to release the old man. He approached Ellen, and in a low voice said, "Ellen, are you still inexorable? Do you still reject and pronounce a father's doom?" Ellen, who was in the deepest torment and anxiety at the peril in which her father was placed, replied, "Count Alfonso, think not that thy riches dazzle me. Think not that I could ever love thee. My heart is already broken. My hopes of happiness are lost forever. He whom I loved, dearer than my life, is now buried beneath the merciless waves. I have but one golden link to bind me to the earth. 'Tis my dearest father, and rather than he, the author of my being, should drag through a miserable existence within a loathsome dungeon, I consent to become thy wife." At these words, which were unconsciously spoken by the despairing Ellen, Alfonso's face brightened up, and not appearing to notice Ellen's embarrassment, said, "'Tis well, my girl. To-morrow shall our nuptials be celebrated." And then turning to Marvin, he muttered, "Away to the castle. Let a disguise be procured. Thou shalt for a time assume a monkish garb, and a mock ceremony shall secure for me my prize." "Away, Marvin." Immediately obeyed his master. "Farewell, Ellen," continued he. "Dependant happiness awaits thee." With these words the villain left the house. When Ellen became conscious of the awful promise she had made, she rushed to her father, crying, "Gracious heavens! What have I done? Consented to wed one whom my soul abhors. Oh, father, support me!" She fell senseless in her father's arms. On the following morning, as the village clock struck the 9th hour, a young sailor appeared on the bridge by the side of Arnold's cottage. This was no other than the long-lost Edward, who, unknown to the person who had written the letter to Arnold, had been rescued from his perilous situation by another vessel which happened to pass him at the time. "Heave a lead!" exclaimed he in a jovial manner to his shipmates. "Just steer down to yonder grog shop, and when I've seen my little craft, I'll set sail after you." They shook hands with him, and went to make merry. Edward now came across the little bridge, and looking steadfastly at his protector's cottage, he said, "There's the house in which I was brought up from my infancy. There dwells my father. No, not my father exactly, but he has always proved himself a warm-hearted friend to me, and I can't find another name good enough for him. How I long to kiss the sweet lips of my dear Ellen. Bless her little daylights, she little thinks I'm here, or damn me, she'd be in my arms in the turning of a handspike. I don't know how it is, but my heart flutters about like the topsail in a gale of wind." A villager and his betrothed now crossed the bridge. "Now listen to me," exclaimed the girl. "Lumpkin, I tell thee what it is. I've made up my mind I won't be married till next Sunday. Surely thee can wait till then." "No," returned her lover, "I be not going to wait any longer. Haven't we been making love for these last 2 years, and now we ought to be thinking of something else? He, we be losing time." "Oh, nonsense," said Phoebe. "I'm sure thee oughtn't to be in such a hurry. Besides, Sunday be such a fine day to be married, and all the villagers will be dressed in their new clothes like." "I tell thee what it is, Phoebe, you don't love me. You don't behave well to me. You don't consider my tender feelings. I tell thee what it is. I've made up my mind I won't be married. I'll die a virgin, I will." He was about to leave her when Phoebe ran after him, and taking a firm hold of the tails of his coat, cried out, "Oh, my Lumpkin, do stay and marry me. I'll do anything you please." "Well, then," said Lumpkin, "give me a kiss, lass." He kissed her, and then proceeded, "You see, Phoebe, the reason that I want to be married to day is because my Lord Alfonso is going to do the same, and as Ellen, the daughter of Arnold, is to be his wife, they may give us a trifle for keeping 'em company like." Edward, who had remained by the cottage unnoticed, now rushed forward, and seizing the affrighted Lumpkin by the throat, cried, "Liar! Vile calumniator!" They both imagined it to be Edward's ghost, and as soon as Lumpkin was released from Edward's grasp, they hastily made their way over the bridge, exclaiming, "Murder! Ghost! Murder!" Edward stood for some time in astonishment. He could not believe his Ellen false, and yet why should they have spoken thus? As he stood in the agony of suspense, the cottage door opened. "Ah, 'tis Ellen!" he exclaimed. "Edward!" cried Ellen. The sudden joy overcame her, and she fell insensible into the arms of her lover. Tears glistened in the eyes of her lover as he gazed upon her lovely cheek. "Poor Ellen," said he, "can she be false? Has time obliterated my name from her memory? It is, it must be so. One last kiss, and then farewell forever." He imprinted a kiss upon her pale cheek. As Ellen now recovered, on again beholding Edward, she cried, "'Tis no dream. It is my dear, dear Edward." "Dear!" he exclaimed reproachfully. "Oh, canst thou still use that word? Hast thou not promised to wed Count Alfonso?" Then raising his voice, he continued, "Say, Ellen, say, it is false as hell, a foul calumny, or we part forever." "Oh, Edward," she replied, "it is true that in a moment of distraction I consented, but I can explain." "Explain!" interrupted he. "Ay, thou canst tell me that the vows of constancy, when we parted, are forgotten; that riches dazzled thee; for the sake of splendor thou didst forget the poor sailor, he who tenderly loved you from his childhood, and would have died for your sake. Thou art false, false!" Ellen, farewell for ever." With these words he rushed from her presence. He had proceeded some distance when he discovered he had reached the gate of his rival's abode, when suddenly he heard a faint cry of distress. It gradually became more powerful, and listening he caught the following words: "This way, Marvin, follow me." Edward immediately concealed himself from notice. When Alfonso approached with Ellen, whom he had seized in the act of endeavoring to retrace her lover's footsteps, Marvin followed him. "Villains, wretches!" exclaimed the terrified girl. "Taunt on, proud girl," returned Alfonso. "I care not for thy words, they are useless. Ha, ha! Behold thy future home, the castle of Alfonso." "Release me, my lord, or dread heaven's vengeance." "Never. Now, girl, thou shalt keep thy promise. This night thou shalt be mine." "Oh, my lord," said the weeping maiden, "if thou hast the smallest ray of pity in thy heart, if you would not seal my death, in mercy restore me to my father." "Never," returned the count. "Thou hast pledged thy word to become mine, and by my power thou shalt keep it." "Hence, monster, hence!" said Ellen, firmly. "It was madness that tempted me to pronounce that odious sentence. I was bereaved of him who loved me faithfully. A letter informed me of his death. You was about to drag my aged father to a loathsome dungeon. In that moment of frenzy I unconsciously uttered the detested words, but rather than become thine cowardly villain, I would perish." "Ellen," exclaimed the villain, "my triumph is complete. Thou art in my power. Thy cries are heeded not, and thus do I take possession of my prize." He seized Ellen by the arm, and was about to drag her into the castle, when she struggled with him, eventually secured a dagger that was in his belt, and rushing from him, cried in a resolute tone: "Stand back, I say! Do you, or your hired myrmidon, move but one step to approach me, and I bury this dagger in my bosom." Edward, who had observed all that had passed, rushed toward her, exclaiming in a tone of rapture: "She is innocent! Ellen, I have wronged thee." He eagerly embraced her, and then suddenly turned to the astonished villains. Placing his hands upon his knees, and staring full in the face, he fearlessly uttered the following words: "Oh, you couple of damned piratical land sharks! Insult a woman! Shame on you! She's in your power! Eh?" continued he, repeating Alfonso's words. "I will tell you what it is, you lubbers. Never but through my heart shall you harm a hair of this maiden's head. Hence, dog, or take the reward of thy temerity!" proudly exclaimed Alfonso. "There, just stand on one side, Ellen," said Edward coolly, "and I will show them the consequences of insulting a defenseless girl. Come on, you couple of swabs! I'll soon settle your reckoning for you." They immediately rushed upon him. A terrible conflict took place, which lasted a considerable time. At length, by a heavy blow from Marvin's sword, Edward was felled to the ground. They were about to dispatch him, when a shipmate of Edward's, who was passing, rushed between them. "Darn me, what are you about?" exclaimed the weather-beaten tar. "Two against one; that aren't fair play. No, no, Ben, the boatswain, won't stand tamely by and see it. So up with you, lad," said he to Edward, "and we'll show them what stuff British tars are made of." The combat was here renewed, and both pair of combatants being nearly equal in strength, it was doubtful who would prove the victors. Marvin now made a desperate thrust at Ben, who leaped on one side, and the sword entered the breast of Alfonso. At this moment a crowd of villagers and sailors approached the spot. Marvin was immediately secured. Edward raised the dying count in his arms, who in a voice of agony cried: "I die, I die! My brain is bursting, my senses leave me, and ah, what horrid phantom appears to my bewildered gaze! 'Tis the Count Victor whose blood has dyed these hands. And see, see, his infant son! He struggles with the merciless waves. He sinks! Save him, save him!" Here he started, and gave a cry of horror on perceiving the locket which hung from Edward's neck. "Ah!" he continued, "that locket! Thou art he! Say, thy parents!" "Alas!" replied Arnold, who had accompanied the villagers, "he knows them not. That locket was fastened to his waist when I discovered him 16 years ago on yonder beach." "But my orders," said the count, "thou wert placed in that perilous situation, but heaven hath preserved thee. Thou art the son of Count Victor. Thy father perished by these hands. Marvin and myself forged a will. But here," continued he, placing in the hands of Edward a bunch of keys, "in my cabinet thou wilt find the true one, which will restore thee to thy estates. Pardon, forgive me. Hark! 'Tis Victor calls. Mercy, mercy!" He gave a faint struggle, and in another moment was a lifeless corpse. Ellen and Edward rushed into each other's arms, as all present simultaneously exclaimed: "Long live Count Victor!" The original will was discovered where Alfonso stated. Edward soon after united himself to his beloved and faithful Ellen, and the peasantry around blessed the benevolent Count and Countess Victor. Section 5. Section 6 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 7, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 6. Chatelar to Mary Stuart. It was to die for thee I left my home across the bounding sea, my mind of every thought bereft, save what wild fancy framed of thee. It was to serve thee, day by day, thine eyes' entrancing glance to see. I made my soul to hope a prey, and lost my peace to die for thee. The time was once when war and fame for me had power, all else above, when to obtain a hero's name amongst the youth of France I strove. But since that form of light I knew, renown a shadow seemed to be. My only bliss was in thy view, my only fame to die for thee. The bird that sings the livelong night, if he should love some glorious star, must perish in its glowing light, that will not stoop to earth so far. All that I dared to hope is o'er. Thy praise shall wake no more from me, then chill me with thy frowns no more. The cloud is past, I die for thee. End of Section 6. End of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 7, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree.